Hello everyone, I'm Secular Spirit, and in this video, I'm going to share my full leaving Islam story. I originally shared this story in a live video 3 years ago, but it had a bunch of laggy streaming issues, so I'd been meaning to do an improved extended version ever since, and figured, well, since this December is Ex-Muslim Awareness Month, now was the perfect timing. So I left Islam when I was 18 years old, and I'm 35 now, so I've been an ex-Muslim and an atheist for almost half my life. And although I left Islam a long time ago, it took years to reconstitute my whole life philosophy and life purpose without Islam. And that process eventually led to me waking up one day and realizing, okay, I'm a completely different person now, and I'm enjoying life, and I don't have to believe in a God. I don't have to believe in Islam or any other religion to get to that place of happiness. And if there's anything I want people to take away from this channel, it's that you don't need to have a God in your life. You don't need to have a promise of an afterlife or a divine justice or objective truths of good and evil to be able to lead that meaningful, fulfilling life. And I'm a living example of that. So I'm not saying that my life is perfect or I have everything figured out, but I take on all the challenges I face in life and I accept that this life might be the only thing I have. And it doesn't stop me from enjoying life despite those challenges. If anything, I try to see those challenges as things to overcome and that will make me ultimately a better person. Not because some God says so, but because that's how I choose to view my life. And it's what I observe benefiting others in the reality around me. So if there's anything that I want people to take from this channel, I hope it's that. You're not alone if you have those doubts and feelings of uncertainty about whatever religion you happen to be in. And there is a way out of it. And there is a life that can be had without that religion. So I wanted to start by just talking about my upbringing and how Islam was introduced into my life. So I have a bit of a complicated background. So I'm originally Palestinian. My parents, they're both Palestinian. Yet I have never personally been to Palestine. I was born outside of Palestine. So long story short, like many Palestinians, my father is a refugee and he met my mother somewhere else and they ultimately settled down in the United Arab Emirates. So that's a country in the Persian Gulf. It's next to Saudi Arabia, just south of Iran. And while it's close to those pretty religious Muslim countries, it's a bit of a more relaxed country when it comes to Islam. And one of the reasons for that is that there's a lot of tourists that come into the United Arab Emirates, and the government there just struck a balance between trying to placate those who really want a traditional Islamic basis for society and all those Westerner tourists or non-Muslim migrant workers who are coming in and they don't want to be expected to have their women wearing hijabs, and they don't want to basically be under the control of Islamic Sharia law. So in that environment, the best way of describing how I was introduced to Islam is that I can't remember exactly when I was first told about it. It's just kind of one of those things where you're told, this is what life is. Everything came from this being, this entity called God, and he loves you, and everything that's good comes from him, and he punishes you if you're bad. So there's all these angels and demons, and even a head demon who whispers in your ear to make you sin, to do bad things. So all this stuff was pretty much with me from a very young age. I always knew I was Muslim as well, so I didn't really understand what that entailed. I just thought, well, everybody's Muslim, and that's because that's what God wants us to be. And it's only when I moved to Canada when I was around, about 4 years old that I was introduced to other religions and other cultures. So I spent the first 4 years of my life living in Dubai, which is in the United Arab Emirates, and I moved to Canada. And that's when I encountered Christians. I encountered Jewish people. I encountered people from all sorts of walks of life, all sorts of religions, Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, you name it. And that's when the idea was introduced to me that, well, I'm Muslim, and that makes me different from all these other people. But what my parents tried to, I guess, teach me was that as long as you're a good person, that's all that matters. And God will see that you are a kind, good, giving person and will reward you in the afterlife with paradise, with heaven. And heaven was this idea in my head of, well, this is the goal that you're aspiring to in your whole entire life. And it's just this perfect place of happiness where you're going to be with your loved ones, all of your loved ones, and all your relatives, and you're going to be there for eternity in bliss with God. So it's hard to really kind of explain why I believe that so willingly. I suppose it falls into the realm of things that, well, my parents are telling me this, all the people around me who I trust for everything else, the people who feed me, clothe me, teach me, take care of me, are telling me this. So I guess in my young mind, I didn't see any reason for it not to be true. I did sort of grasp that this is something that you can't experience immediately in the world around you. So it's not something like, oh, there's a store at the end of the street and you can see the store. It's something that transcends this world, but it's there all around us all the same. But for me, the difference was just semantics. It's just this is the life here, and then you go on to the afterlife. And so all of this stuff was taught to me by my parents without much in the way of drilling it in, forcing it down into me, forcing it down my throat. It was just part of my identity and who I was. I wouldn't say I was particularly religious or did much that was Islamic in those early years when I was living in Canada, when I was around 5, 6, 7 years old. It was mostly just a thing to say. I'm Muslim, I believe in God, and we didn't pray much either. I actually didn't start praying until I moved back to Dubai with my family when I was about 8 or 9 years old. So I spent 5 years living in the West in Canada and a year as well in the UK. And when I was in the UK, I went to an Anglican school, and I was, as far as I could tell anyway, the only Muslim kid there. And everyone around me was Christian, and we had to read from the Bible, or I think it was the Bible anyway, every morning. And there was some sort of Christianity class. I remember coloring in these lesson books about Jesus turning the water into wine and the miracle of feeding thousands of people with a handful of bread and fish. So I learned about all those miracles of Jesus. And that's when my parents started telling me a bit more about why there was this difference between us as Muslims and the Christians. So you have these Christians and they believe in the same God that we believe in, but they're different. I didn't really ask why we were different because it seemed kind of obvious to me. While my background's Arab and I speak Arabic, I'm Palestinian. I'm in this country surrounded by initially Canadian people and then British people. So obviously we have all of these blatant, visual and cultural differences. So I guess they have their God and then there's mine. And it was around this point that was probably introduced to me as well that my religion and my God, my version of my God, the way I worshiped him and how I obeyed him was better, superior than the other ways, the other religions. I don't think this was something that was blatantly told to me by my parents. It was just something I naturally assumed because, well, I think a lot of people from a lot of cultures have this feeling that we kind of have the best thing going on here. And that was impressed on me as well. So, Arabic food, well, it's just better. Our culture, our language is more sophisticated. So, I had all these ideas, and I suppose Islam was lumped in with it as well. So, that's the early stuff. And it's really only when I moved back to Dubai, again, when I was around 8 or 9 years old, that Islam was properly introduced to me. So up to that point, I don't think I'd ever even been to a mosque to pray. I probably had, just don't remember it, didn't linger in my memory. My parents just seemed to be very relaxed on that kind of stuff. The only sorts of things we used to do was fast for Ramadan. I wouldn't at first because I was still too young, but everyone around me and my family would, and we'd celebrate all the big festivals of Islam like Eid al-Adha, but that was pretty much it. When I moved to Dubai, I started fourth grade, and as part of the national curriculum in the school I went to, I had to be taught Islamic education since I was Muslim. So it was pretty much mandatory, and that's where I really got taught about Islam. So it was just a class like any other class. So I'd have a couple classes of English, math, science, biology, history, whatever it was, and then there would be Islamic education period that the Christians in my school were exempted from attending. And that's where I was first really introduced to the Quran, the Muslim holy book. We had one in our house, but I hadn't really touched it. And that's also where I was introduced to the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, the things he had said that had been recorded and preserved. And the thing that I found difficulty with when I was trying to read those Quran verses, and to a lesser extent the hadiths as well, was that it was all in this classical Arabic that was very, very different than the contemporary Arabic that I spoke. So, in case anyone's watching this who doesn't know this about Arabic, there's this is kind of simplifying, but there's really two kinds of Arabic that exist. So, there's the formal kind, Fusha Arabic, and that's the kind of Arabic that you'll often see in books, especially nonfiction books, or newspaper articles, and the kind of Arabic that news anchors will speak on TV and that people will use for formal things like speeches, that kind of stuff. And then there's the language that people actually talk in, the Arabic that people actually talk in, which I guess you could say is like a slang. So it's more casual, different words for everything, and it differs from region to region. So as a Palestinian, there's a certain way that I speak, and I use certain slang words that someone from Saudi Arabia wouldn't use, or someone from one of the North African Arabic countries wouldn't use. So many Arabs learn or at least know how to understand the Fusha kind of Arabic. So it's almost a universal Arabic in that sense. But the Quran Arabic, so it's not quite either, but it is closer to the formal Fusha kind. But it was very archaic and hard for me to understand. And just as a reminder, I was coming from having spent the last 5 years as a child living in the West, and living in the West, I wasn't reading from the Quran every day or using it because I was usually speaking in English or talking Arabic of the second kind, the slang kind, with my parents. And so my Arabic was also very rusty in the beginning. So it took me a while to get caught up to speed again. So that was a big hurdle. And the thing to remember about the Quran and the Arabic in it is that it's a challenge for a lot of native Arabic speakers, ones who've spoken and worked in Arabic their entire lives, to read the Quran and properly understand what it's communicating, because there's so much of it that is wrapped up in context or was written for some specific purpose. And so I always think about all the Muslims who aren't Arabic speakers, people from countries like Indonesia or India and Pakistan, where for the most part, they don't even speak Arabic at all. They'll understand a little bit, but they don't really know the language at a sophisticated level. And yet they're Muslim and they're expected to understand the meaning of the Quran and the Hadith, which is in Arabic. And I'd say you do have to have a sophisticated knowledge of that classical Arabic to properly understand everything that's being said in the Quran. So, me as a native Arabic speaker who didn't understand the classical Arabic that well of the Quran, I could read all the words, but there were a lot of words in there that I just didn't know, that I wasn't familiar with, kind of like how I felt when I was reading Lord of the Rings in English for the first time as a kid. There were a lot of big words that I just didn't know. Or going back to the Quran, I didn't understand what they meant in the context that they were being used in, which is why it was very important that we had a teacher explaining it all to us, which I later found problematic when I began questioning Islam, and I'll get into that later in this video. So, because the Quran and Hadith are often difficult to understand, many Muslims rely on imams and the teachers in the madrasas, the schools, to tell them what everything means. And this makes me draw a parallel with the schism that happened between Catholicism and Protestantism. So one of the reasons why Protestantism became a thing was because a lot of people were tired of all these Christian ceremonies being done in Latin, a language that commoners didn't speak or understand. And people wanted their Bible and the ceremonies to be more accessible in their native tongues instead of in Latin. But that wasn't good for Catholicism, and it isn't good for Islam, because religious leaders would lose control over information to the people if the holy books were easy to understand. If you need a teacher or imam or a priest or whoever telling you what to think, someone in a position of power, religious power, then they control what you believe, especially when it's coming to this important subject of religion. Just as an aside, there have been growing efforts by the Muslim and Christian community to make their holy books more easily understandable today. And I do think that's for the benefit of the followers of both those religions, because then they can actually see the words of those books for themselves and see the often horrifying ideas in them for themselves and try to figure out if they stand for that stuff or not. But yeah, so the Quran was in this obscure ancient Arabic, and I was expected to just memorize it. And that's what Islamic education was for me pretty much for the entire time I was in school. Read this, memorize it, regurgitate it, and just do whatever the teacher tells you to do. So remember what the teacher told you this meant, and this meant. And we'd have to also read the Quran. So there's, I guess the best way of explaining it is there's a poetic way of reading the Quran that's taught in schools across the world as well. And I was always terrible at that. And so from early on, I didn't do well at Islamic education. So I was a pretty good student in almost everything else. But Islamic education was one of my weakest subjects. And that's probably why I started feeling, I wouldn't say guilt necessarily. The guilt came on a little bit later, and we're going to get into that for sure. But I felt like I had something to prove when it came to Islamic education or just the subject of Islam, because it wasn't really something that was talked about at my house. And I wasn't doing well at it at school, and I was struggling to read the Quran properly, to understand the words in it. And so I felt this need to do more, and that, I guess, became a need to be a better Muslim. And early on, I'd say fifth grade, maybe sixth grade, I would have been around 9 years old, maybe 10, something like that. And that's when the really intense Islamic teaching started creeping in. So you'd have the lessons from select verses from the Quran and from select hadiths that were chosen for the curriculum. But at the same time, Mr. Muhammad, who was my Islamic education teacher, would also share different anecdotes, stories about Islam, and tell us, use those stories as ways of teaching us different things about the religion. So he'd tell us about what would happen to you after death. So there was, again, this heaven, this paradise, where you were with all your loved ones, and this paradise was tiered, so at different levels. So the more good you were, the better your dwelling, the better neighborhood you would have in heaven. Kind of makes sense because that's kind of how this world works, right? And if you were bad and you would go to hell, what basically happened was you get this book, a book of your deeds. So there were these angels who would be constantly watching your movements, and they'd be with you wherever you went. Wherever you went, they were there. And if you did something good, it would go down in this one book. And if you did something bad, it would go down in this other book. And at the end of it all, once you were dead and the day of judgment had come, and we're going to get into the day of judgment very soon, you would be given the book of your deeds. And if the book is presented to you in your right hand, great, you're going to paradise. But if you're given the book in your left hand, that means you did more bad than good, and you're going to go to hell. And the image I had in my mind was, so I have these two angels watching me all the time, scrutinizing me for everything I'm doing. And then there's, of course, God watching me as well, I guess, doing the same exact thing. So I didn't really think about why he needed to delegate these two angels to do the work when he was all powerful, but I just felt like I was constantly being monitored and carefully watched. And it messed with my mind in some ways, that feeling of being watched. I had a phase for years where I felt so embarrassed about God and the two angels seeing my naked body that I would actually shower wearing my underwear. And then I'd change into a fresh pair while wearing a towel around me. So I guess I was around 10 or 11 at the time. And it didn't occur to me that no towel or any amount of clothing could stop supernatural beings like angels, let alone God himself, from seeing what I looked like naked if they really wanted to see it. I now call this my never-nude phase since watching the sitcom Arrested Development, which, if you haven't seen it, has a character who also is a never-nude wearing cut-off jean shorts in the shower. I remember first seeing that show and that character years later as a teenager and being astonished, even though it was a sitcom joke, thinking being a never-nude is a real thing. It wasn't just me. And I don't know why or when I stopped doing that, stopped being a never-nude. Probably around 13 years old. I just got tired of doing it. But for years, I'd try and make sure I'd never be naked for more than a couple of seconds because God was always watching me. And even when I stopped doing that, I still felt like God was always watching me. If I did do something bad, I'd think, oh no, God saw me do this. This is bad. Whatever it was, just lying, or I don't know, I wasn't that bad of a kid. So I didn't do much that was evil or sinful, but I did do things like lie. I'd steal sometimes, or I'd have bad thoughts about my classmates, or hateful thoughts about teachers, or I'd be really rude to my parents, which is a big no-no in Islam. And I'd think, no, God is going to be judging me for this. And I think that's when the guilt started coming in. One of the main reasons I was guilty was because as a Muslim, you're supposed to pray 5 times a day. And those prayers are spread out throughout the day, starting uh, early in the day, sunrise, and going into the late evening. And there was one day in school, so this would have been maybe as early as 4th grade, so soon after I moved back to Dubai to live there for the second time, when our teacher told us, okay, we're going to the mosque, the school mosque, and we're going to pray together. And it dawned on me at that moment, like it never occurred to me before, that I don't even know how to pray. my parents never taught me, and it just somehow never came up, which was confusing. But in the moment, I was panicking. And when I got home that day and I knew I had to pray in the school mosque the next day, I instinctively knew that me not knowing how to pray was something bad. If my teacher and my fellow students found out that I couldn't pray, I already wasn't doing well in that class, the Islamic education class, and I was already different from everyone else because I'd spent so many years living in the West, in the UK and Canada. I even had a bit of a British accent at the time because I just come from the UK. So I already stood out in all these ways, and I was thinking, oh no, I'm going to stand out in this way as well when people will see that I can't even pray. They're going to think I'm just this big sinner and I don't even know how to be a Muslim and all that stuff. So I really, really wanted to avoid being in that position. So I go back home from school and I go to my parents. I think I started with my mother, and I asked her, can you teach me how to pray? I have to pray tomorrow in school. And she just kind of gave me this glazed look like, oh, I don't know how to pray. And I was stunned in that moment. Even though we hadn't prayed together as a family, really, I figured, well, she's a Muslim. She must know, because praying to God is the most important thing we can do in this life, isn't it? And she almost kind of laughed it off. And I asked my father as well, and he pretty much had the same reaction. He just said, I don't know. I didn't really get any help from them, and they didn't try to find anything for me or try to, I guess Google wasn't a thing back then, or was just starting to become a thing, but they didn't even look it up on the internet. And I just remember feeling, wow, my parents both don't know how to pray. They're just sinners, I suppose. And luckily, I have a younger brother, and he had one of those illustrated books that actually had a detailed list of steps that you're supposed to follow to pray and to do the wudu, which is the ablutions to clean yourself with water, to cleanse yourself before prayer. And so I borrowed the book, and I just spent that evening scrambling to try and learn how to do it, how to do the wudu, and try to memorize all the different little things you have to say during the prayers, and memorizing all the steps. So I'd consult the book, read a bunch of stuff, try to memorize it, and then I'd rush to the bathroom to do the wudu, the ablutions, then think, damn, what did I forget? What the hell did I miss? And I'd run back to my book. And I remember I was starting to ruin my brother's book because the pages were getting wet from me trying to do the wudu and then rushing back and forth and turning the pages and seeing, oh no, I forgot this step, or I didn't do this step properly. So I have to try again. And I was just desperate to get it all right, so that no one noticed that there was anything off about me. And this probably took hours. And eventually, by the time it was bedtime, I had pretty much had it. And the next day, when we had to go pray in the school mosque, obviously I forgot quite a bit of it because it was just panic mode that was keeping me going the previous night. And yet I managed to remember enough for it to stick, and for me to basically fake my way through it. And that kind of really established my relationship with Islam. It felt like this thing that I was supposed to be doing, but I didn't know how to do it properly. And I was afraid everyone around me would notice that I wasn't doing it properly. And then I'd be exposed as a bad Muslim, and I think deeper down than that, as a bad person, a bad human being. And so I already felt like I wasn't a real Arab at that point because I'd spent so many years living in the West. I already felt like this big outsider because I just noticed that I thought differently than others, and I didn't talk like anyone else around me. It's kind of hard to explain, but that's what it felt like. And I just wanted to limit as much as possible the ways that I was an outsider. So after that, I really stepped up my efforts to be a Muslim. So I have to learn how to pray, and I have to pray as much as possible. The 5 prayers a day thing was something I always struggled with, that kind of consistency. I knew I had to do it, but I really didn't successfully manage to do it that often. It was this combination of laziness, and I guess that's what it was, laziness and feeling almost like someone who's addicted to cigarettes, thinking I can always just quit later. So I had this feeling, you could say maybe in the reverse, that I can always just catch up on my prayers later and all will be fine. So it was this bargain I was doing with myself to just spare myself the effort of doing it if I'm looking back in retrospect with honesty. And I think just because my parents weren't praying around me, I didn't feel this more immediate pressure to do it. It was this just internal guilt pressure. So if anything, there were a lot of times where I would pray in secret in my bedroom because I didn't want my parents to comment on me praying or bringing it up, because again, I just had the suspicion that they were sinners or they wouldn't understand or they would feel weird about it. It's really hard to explain it because I had this guilt from that at the time, but I also started noticing that I was having this antagonistic relationship with my parents when it came to the subject of Islam. So the thing that's so odd about that was, with everything else, my relationship with my parents was completely normal. So it was only when it came to Islam, I started having this judgmental, antagonistic attitude towards them of, wow, you don't even know what you're doing. You're sinners. And I noticed that my parents wouldn't fast properly during Ramadan, the holy month of Ramadan. My father wouldn't eat, which you're not supposed to, between sunrise and sunset, but he'd still drink coffee or smoke cigarettes. And I pointed that out to him one year and he insisted, oh, I'm still fasting. I'm just still smoking or whatever. And so I just thought my parents were these lazy Muslims. And I noticed that there were a lot of people like that around me in the community. So whether that was family, friends, or neighbors. So these are all people who were Muslim, but they didn't do all 5 prayers every day. They didn't fast properly. They didn't do everything that they were supposed to do. And I felt, wow, they're going to hell. And I'm a better Muslim than them because at least I'm trying and I feel guilty about it. And I think if I was to psychoanalyze myself now, I think that those feelings of judgment were to deflect from my own guilt about my inadequacy, about me being a Muslim, my failings as a Muslim as I saw them. And if I were to theorize a bit, I suspect that's why a lot of Muslims are pretty judgmental towards ex-Muslims like myself, or people they consider to be sinful Muslims. So maybe Muslim women who don't wear the hijab or, whatever. So I think it's partially to deflect from their own feelings of inadequacy, the things that they know that they're not doing properly as Muslims. So going back to the sort of antagonistic relationship I had with my parents when it came to Islam, I didn't really express it to them. So I'd have snide remarks, little jabbing comments or veiled jokes at them. I talk about how, wow, nobody touches the Quran in our house. It's covered in dust. It's just collecting dust. And I was pretty much the only one who would read from it until I got my own Quran, personal Quran. And as for me, I would have a phase where I really didn't do anything Islamic pretty much beyond just the stuff that I had to do for my Islamic education classes. But then I'd have the phases where I'd feel guilty about not doing anything in those other phases and try to do everything I possibly could. So I'd do the 5 prayers a day. I'd try reading from the Quran every day. And during Ramadan, the holy month, I would really escalate those efforts. There was a thing that was popular with my classmates where you'd read a chapter or a surah from the Quran every day. And there was a way of reading the entire Quran during Ramadan where you divided it into equal sections so you could finish it in 30 days. So you'd read a section every day and finish the Quran. And so I do that and I'd fast. And I remember feeling this glowing, immense pride when I did all those things. I felt like, okay, I'm finally doing what God wants me to do. I remember times when I'd pray alone in my room behind a closed door and I'd put everything else out of my mind. I'd focus on the steps of prayer and I'd feel the presence of God. When Christians talk about feeling or experiencing the Holy Spirit, I think those moments were the closest I had to that feeling, because I really would feel like there was something there with me. I would feel like God was with me and watching me and was so happy with me. And I could feel this love within me when I did these good things. And that's what really made it harder when I would relapse. And relapse is the best word to use when I would stop praying and I wouldn't read the Quran as much, and I'd start doing things again like lying and stealing, and I'd just feel terrible. I'd feel awful. And I think one of the reasons why I felt terrible was, beyond the guilt from disappointing God, was this fear of hell. So around this time, I'm still pretty young. I'm still 9 or 10 when I was taught my class about hell. We were taught in the school about the punishments of hell. And there's a verse in the Quran, there's an ayah in the Quran in Surah Al-Nisa that talks about how one of the punishments for the disbelievers is that their skin will be burned off from, I suppose, the intense heat, the fire of hell. But then your skin would grow back only for it to burn off again. So it was this cycle of skin burning, melting off, and then growing back, and melting off, burning off, and growing back. And I thought about other things, like how you would be constantly thirsty. So no matter how much you drink, your thirst would never be quenched in any way while you're drinking boiling hot water or whatever it was that you could drink in hell. And you'd go for a piece of fruit, but it would all be filled with spikes and thorny, so your mouth would bleed from the inside, even though you were super hungry, so you'd still eat them anyway. And that was what happened to you if you sinned more than you did good, or if you left God. And I had a second Islamic education teacher who was also called Mr. Muhammad. So this is the second Mr. Muhammad Islamic education teacher. So he started teaching me from the 7th grade, and he took it up a notch. So he took it to the next level where he'd constantly be mentioning these things that we should expect in hell. And I think he did it for our benefit. So from his perspective, I suppose. And I can see the warped argument for it being a good thing to teach kids this, because it kept them in check. It keeps kids in check. It keeps them self-monitoring their own behavior, to always know that this is what happens to the non-believers or the sinners or whatever you want to call them. So it's kind of like having an internal policeman who make sure you're always doing a good thing or avoiding all the bad things. So one of the things that terrified me the most in those early years was talk about the day of judgment. So there's a similar concept in Christianity, and what it basically is that there will come this time, and as Mr. Muhammad would often say, that the signs for this time approaching are upon us, and it could happen at any moment now. So be prepared and make sure you're doing everything that you're supposed to be doing and avoiding all the things that you're supposed to be avoiding. So on this day of judgment, the angel Israfil would blow this trumpet, and when that trumpet sounded, every living human on earth would die and their souls would rise up so they could be judged. But before that happened, there would be all these horrendous apocalyptic events happening all around the world. So there would be the Islamic version of the Antichrist who would emerge. So he's called a Dajjal in Arabic. And this person would pretend to be Jesus returned. So that's something that Muslims also believe, that Jesus will come back on the day of judgment, but this false Jesus, this Dajjal, will appear and he will look like Jesus, but true believers, the true Muslims, will be able to detect that he isn't actually Jesus. But all the followers, including Muslims, who end up being tricked by this Dajjal, this false prophet, into following him, will end up going to hell with him. So this was one thing I was paranoid about. Like, what if I'm tricked by the Dajjal and I just want to do the right thing? I just want to follow the right person. I want to follow the right Jesus because I want to go to heaven. I want to go to paradise. I want to be with my family. And now this Dajjal is showing up and he's trying to trick us. So there's already Iblis, the devil, trying to trick me all the time anyway, whispering in my ear whenever I'm thinking of doing something bad. It's because Iblis is whispering in my ear. And then there was all the jinn, which are spirits that exist, I guess you could say, in an alternate dimension of reality. So I never was really clear on where they were or what they were exactly. But anyway, some of them were evil, and they would try to possess you or whisper in your ear and make you do bad things. So I'm just this little kid and I had all these things to worry about. And then there were all the other signs of the day of judgment that were emerging in our world, supposedly. So, for example, Mr. Muhammad would say, and this is all being talked about in school to little kids, I have to remind you. So, Mr. Muhammad would say that one of the signs of Judgment Day would be that there would be wars everywhere and the number of wars would be multiplying, increasing. And he'd point out, well, if you look at the news, there's wars happening everywhere. And I'd say, he's right. There are wars happening everywhere. And because I'd see them in the news, and he'd say that there'd be droughts all around the world. And I'd think, well, there are droughts all around the world. And so I would come back home from school and I'd just go to the TV right away and start watching the news and worry because I'd see, oh, there's another war. And then I would just check the weather report to see if it was raining in some parts of the world, because then it would be, okay, phew, it's raining here, it's raining there. We don't have global droughts, so we're good for now. And I think there were other signs, like the Arabic world would be in turmoil, the Middle East would be in turmoil, which it was, and there would be internal rifts in it and the external world, between the Middle East and the external world, the world of the West, which I guess back in the Prophet Muhammad's time would be the Byzantine Empire, and I guess for us today would be the American Empire. So the thinking was that one of the signs of Judgment Day would be that the American Empire would be taking over our world. And when I was a kid, the invasion of Afghanistan happened, and the invasion of Iraq happened, and I thought, yes, this is what's happening. The Arabic world is falling apart, and we're totally under the thumb of America, and Israel is rampant in Palestine as well. So I was thinking, oh no, the day of judgment could be happening at any moment, and I'd have nightmares about it. Sometimes I'd hear a loud noise, especially in the early morning when I was alone in bed, and I'd think, is that the trumpet of Israfil that's going to bring the day of judgment? I was so terrified that if it happened at this moment, I didn't have time to pray enough. I didn't have time to do everything I was supposed to do as a good Muslim. Do I have enough good deeds to get into heaven? That's what I was thinking at the time, because that's it. Once it's over, it's over. And there were other things that Mr. Muhammad would say about this hell stuff that kind of confused me. He would say, if you're a non-believer, you're going to hell forever. But if you're a good Muslim and you did some bad things, you'd still go to paradise. But first, you just have to go to hell for a bit. So I suppose it's like paying your debt to God by suffering this excruciating torture in hell. So the way he described it was, there's this bridge and you have to cross this bridge to get to paradise. And so underneath this bridge is hell. And he told my classmates and I that if you were a good Muslim and you did everything that you were supposed to do, you did everything right, and you obeyed God and all of his commands, you would sprint effortlessly down this bridge across this valley that was that had hell at the bottom of it. But if you were a Muslim and you had committed sins in your life, then the bridge would disappear under your feet and you would plummet down into hell. And depending on how bad you were, or are, you'd spend as much time as God deemed it necessary for you to spend before you went up to paradise. And I remember being terrified about that as well, because I just visualized this bridge in my mind, and I'd think, just imagine being in that position and hoping and praying the bridge wouldn't disappear beneath me. And I remember really thinking about that feeling, that sinking feeling in your chest when you just suddenly fall. Like, maybe a good way of explaining it is like when you're walking downstairs and you think, oh, there's one more step, and there isn't. And so your body just panics when you take that step and it isn't there. And so I had this feeling too that would probably be 100 times worse when you just fall through and then you're in hell. And I do remember thinking at the time that it's a little bit weird that God sent you to just be tortured for a bit, and then you just go up to paradise, and I suppose everything's all right, no friction, no awkwardness there between you and God, so you're all good. But I didn't think about it too much because God knows best, and He's my creator. Everything around here is because of Him. I owe my very existence to Him, so obviously what He says is the best. So I was terrified about these things, and I'd sometimes bring it up to my parents. I didn't find this out until, well, way later on, but my parents actually went to my school many times and complained about Mr. Muhammad saying, why is he teaching our kids all this intense hell stuff when they're still so young? Because he did stray from the curriculum when he talked about it. It would be in the curriculum here and there, because if you ever read the Quran for yourself, it is very full of warnings to the disbelievers, the non-believers, about what punishments will await them in hell. And so I knew it was there, which kind of supplemented what Mr. Muhammad was saying, that was beyond the curriculum. So I had to be vigilant, and I had to do the right thing because I didn't want to go to hell. And of course, it wasn't all just fear and guilt, or else it would be very hard for people to stay Muslim. There were also good things. It felt wonderful to be part of the righteous community of Muslims, being with the forces of good against the forces of evil out there. It felt special. I felt special. And it also felt like a responsibility, for sure, but a blessing. And when I learned the stories of the Prophet Muhammad's life, about how he was a kind, generous, and honest person, even long before he ever became a prophet, I felt all this admiration, especially when he got the first revelation of the Quran and embarked on spreading the message of Islam. It was a message that was not well received by most people in Mecca, the city where he lived, including his family, who saw his call to worship one God as a threat against the polytheistic worship of the time, where there were many, many gods that were worshipped. And that also earned his family a lot of money as the ruling tribe, because they controlled the religious sites in Mecca that pilgrims would flock to long before Islam came to exist. But he didn't care. Islam was the truth, and it was his responsibility to share it. He attracted some followers, but most people reviled him, mocked him, and eventually he had to flee to another city because his life was at risk. And I was blown away by that. He sacrificed his power, money, and all the comforts he had for this message, the message for Islam, for no other reason than it being the right thing to do. I admired the first Muslims, the Sahaba, who also sacrificed everything and in many cases died for the cause of truth and justice of Islam. And I was taught this one story that lingered in my mind for a long, long time. I still remember it today. The story of the Prophet Muhammad taking refuge in Ta'if, a city near Mecca, where he was forced to run again when the locals pelted him with stones. He just lost his wife and his uncle, who was his guardian and protector, and now he was bruised and bloody, all alone, and yet he persevered from that low point to inspire others to help spread Islam. And it was incredible to know that I was part of that legacy. In school, we watched a movie from the 70s called The Message that depicted the origin story of Islam. Although it didn't show the Prophet Muhammad because that's blasphemy. So I do recommend watching it for perhaps a crash course in how to make a movie without ever showing the main character. It makes for very weird viewing because they play this eerie, mystical sort of music whenever Muhammad approaches an on-screen character or speaks.
Muhammad, when I hunt the desert at night, I know God is not kept in the house.
So you only ever see other characters react to Muhammad and you never hear Muhammad's voice. And that movie was so inspirational. Like, I remember thinking at the time that was better than even Lord of the Rings because unlike Lord of the Rings, which was fantasy, this story in The Message was real. It actually happened. It was a true triumph of good over evil. And through those stories, I did learn a lot of good things. To be generous, forgiving, kind, patient, selfless, modest, brave. Muhammad and those first Muslims, the Sahaba, they were role models for me. People I aspired to emulate. And in many ways, I felt I did emulate them. I didn't really do many bad things, like I mentioned before, beyond lying and cheating and stealing sometimes. But once I hit puberty and I started developing all that stuff that comes with being a young teenage boy, and I started looking at girls differently, started looking at women around me differently, that's when the guilt really hit another level. And I would say it became shame as well, because what I was taught was you're not supposed to do anything sexual with a woman until marriage, which came on much later in life. And anything sexual with a woman outside of marriage, or even just related to women, is a huge sin. So masturbation is a huge sin as well. Touching yourself is very bad for you. And I'd hear all these things that I think other kids would hear about in more religious countries and different cultures. For example, if you masturbated a lot, everyone would know because you'd have really hairy knuckles. And my biology teacher in school, and I believed this for years, my biology teacher told us once that if you masturbate too much when you're a teenager, then you're not going to be able to have kids when you're older because your sperm is diluted or your sperm reservoirs are all dried up. So I believed that too. And it was just really difficult for me because I'd have these intense feelings and desires, and I just had to suppress them and shut them off. I told myself, no, this isn't for me now. This is for marriage. This is for when I'm an adult. This is inappropriate. This is going to send me to hell because this is doing one of the worst things possible. Zina, which is unlawful sexual intercourse. It's one of the worst things you can do as a Muslim. And I think the result of that was, what happened was I found myself, I guess the best thing to say would be that I was drawn, compelled to doing it. To masturbate. And then I'd have this cycle of, let's say I'd masturbate this one time, and then I have this shame spiral afterwards, and then I'd come back again to it. So when I think about it, it really does describe the behavior of someone who's addicted to something. I don't know in this context what the addiction is exactly, but I just had a very unhealthy relationship with my sexuality, with masturbation, that kind of everything related to that. And I avoided girls for the most part because I went to a boys' school. Even though there were girls in my school, the boys and girls were separated in different sections of the school. So there were fences and walls and gates between us. So I didn't really see them that often in my day-to-day life. And I felt, well, this is what society is supposed to be like. You're only supposed to see girls once you're an adult and you're ready for marriage. So for the purpose of marriage. So staying away from them is a good idea. And yet I still felt myself really drawn to wanting to interact with them and wanting to see them because I didn't very often. So then my fixation would be on the female teachers in my school. If there was one female teacher who was just a little bit attractive, there isn't an exaggeration to say she'd be sexually harassed by my classmates and by older boys in my school. I didn't do it personally. Even if I had desires in my mind, I wouldn't externalize them. But what I would see would be scribblings about the more attractive teachers in the boys' bathroom, saying very lewd things. I think you can fill in the blanks. And so I realized at that point that I wasn't the only one going through these challenges. Everyone was just suppressing their desires and finding all these inappropriate outlets to express them without, I suppose, jeopardizing our innocence or standing in front of God and society. And yet, again, it would come out in all these unhealthy, inappropriate ways. And that's when I also started thinking about all the different ways that sexuality is wrong from a Muslim perspective. So I had access to movies, TV shows, and books from the Western world, and some of them would have gay male characters. And I had this idea in my head that sex between two men is A, disgusting and repulsive, and B, a horrible sin. And this was something that I was taught in school, in Islamic education class. It was something that was just built in to all my classmates' mindset, in my mindset, because if anyone even just exhibited any kind of feminine behavior, which was perceived as being gay, they would be teased and taunted and humiliated for it. So in that way, we were always policing each other. And I'd sometimes see people outside of school who I would think in my head, that person's definitely gay, even though I could never know for sure, maybe because they're a little bit effeminate or whatever. And I'd think, wow, that person is going to hell. And I would be repulsed by them. And I think, wow, is that what they do with other men? That's just horrible. And so just overall, I had this very unhealthy relationship with my own sexuality, which was utterly suppressed, and a very judgmental attitude towards sexualities that were outside of what I believed was the norm. And the shame really came to be this problem for me because I couldn't find a way to resolve it. I'd make these vows, commitments to myself that for this month of Ramadan, I'm not going to masturbate for the whole month, which at the time for me was a record-breaking feat. And I also committed to not watching pornography either. And this was something that was limited in its accessibility in the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, but you could find it if you're diligent. And it's something that we shared amongst us in school as well. So I'd make these vows to myself to not do those things anymore, to not share pornography in school, to not watch it. And because I made it so big in my head and thinking that if I fail this, then God is going to judge me, and this is going to be another sin in the book, and God is watching me when I do these filthy, disgusting things, it just put so much pressure on me that I'd cave. I'd cave because it felt like this big bag of bricks on my chest or my back or whatever. And once I just let go and I stopped suppressing myself in that moment, it was releasing. It felt like I was completely free, but then the guilt and the shame would immediately return. I felt, sure, I'm not eating pork. Sure, I'm not drinking alcohol, both of which are forbidden in Islam. And sure, I'm fasting for Ramadan, but I'm really not doing anything else that I'm supposed to be doing. I don't have the word of God on my mouth, on my lips all the time. And I'm doing this horrible thing that I know is a sin, that I know is bad, and I can't stop myself from doing it day in, day out. I can't stop myself from just looking at an attractive woman, whether it's in a movie or in a magazine or in my school or in the mall. And I know I shouldn't, and I still am doing it. And so I was pretty sure at that point in my life that I was going to hell. And with the fear that the day of judgment was coming along at any moment, it was this inner torment that I'm not doing good enough. And this could end, this whole life could end at any moment. And yet, I still didn't want to suppress my sexual desires. I understood why things like praying were helpful, or things like not lying and not stealing, but the desire to just express my sexuality was something that I just couldn't stop. In a way, it had complete control over me because I felt like it was something I had to do to exist as a human being. I just couldn't resist the urge. And that's probably why I guess I could call it an addiction, and why it felt like I was trying to break this addiction. Because of the guilt and shame I had, I felt very awkward and ashamed to be around girls, especially if I was interested in them. I sometimes encountered girls in my school, sometimes in my neighborhood, or just children of family, friends, and I'd always be skittish around them. A, because I just didn't have any experience being around girls, and B, because I felt like doing it was wrong, inappropriate, sinful. So those things were very intertwined for me. And so by the time I was 16, 17, I had little to no experience with girls. And around that same time is when I started having an existential crisis. And this existential crisis is the thing that really sparked my leaving of Islam. And I don't know when it started necessarily. It might have started as early as when I was 15, but I just found myself in this phase in my life. It was around 10th or 11th grade where I just couldn't get myself to be motivated to care about anything I was doing. So I started asking my parents a lot of questions. Why do we exist? Why do I have to go to school? So I'd go from those kinds of intense, abstract questions to more immediate ones of why am I doing what I'm doing in my day to day life? And the big questions of why did God even create us? Why do I exist? And I just started thinking about all the steps that I was going to have to take in life that were still ahead of me because I was a kid. And I already felt so tired of waking up every morning and studying all these subjects that I wasn't really interested in, only for me to just go to a university to get a degree and then get a job and get married and have kids. And just thinking about it, all those steps, it just felt so overwhelming. And it felt like it didn't feel like these were the things I want to do, but that was what I'm supposed to do as a human being. It's the natural order of things. And I couldn't find the motivation to do them in that day in, day out schedule of life. And I remember my grades started slipping, and I'd show up to school with my shirt untucked and buttons undone, and my hair would be a mess, and I wouldn't have showered in days. And my classmates would mock my appearance, but I didn't care. And I wouldn't be doing my homework, and I definitely wasn't praying or reading from the Quran or going to the mosque or doing any of the things that I was supposed to be doing as a Muslim, because I just hated myself. And I started realizing or questioning, I guess, why am I like this? It must be because I'm bad and there's something wrong with me. I'm malfunctioning in some way. So I'm already a bad Muslim. I'm now a bad student, and I'm just this worthless person who doesn't even do anything besides go to school, do the bare minimum, eat and sleep, and sometimes play video games and watch movies. And I knew this was all coming from a place of privilege. And I knew that there were people who were suffering far more than I was and who had much worse lives than me and much more legitimate reason to complain, and who would be grateful to have what I had and that I was just dismissing or not appreciating. And that just added to my guilt and self loathing about feeling this way. Because God gave me all these things, and yet I was still complaining and I was still miserable. And year after year, it got worse. It got to the point where I'd have these long, intense conversations with my mother in particular, where I just asked her, what is the point of this? It was this obsession I had. What is the point? What is the point? My mother would keep things simple and say that you have this family that loves you, and she'd say I'm a great person and that there are good things in life. And I just didn't buy it. And for the most part, I did the bare minimum to get through my life. And I'd always be sullen. I'd have a bad attitude about everything. The things that used to interest me when I was younger, I just stopped doing them for the most part. I used to love playing soccer. I stopped playing soccer. I loved reading books and watching movies, and I'd still do that a little bit, but its role in my life became different. Instead of it being this thing that was this pleasurable activity, it became an escape from my reality where, okay, I don't have to deal with all these unresolved huge issues in my life. I can just lose myself in this TV show or in this book or this movie, because at least then there's nothing at stake for me. It's the characters who are going through everything. I'm just this invisible observer who's not impacted by anything that's going on to those characters. But once the show was over, once the book was over, once the movie was over, then I'd be back. I'd be back to my reality, and I'd try ignoring it or escaping it once again. And it didn't really occur to me that Islam would offer me the solutions to getting out of this crisis. It just felt like this additional thing that I'm guilty about, that I'm insufficient in. And I felt God was disappointed with me, and I was failing in his eyes. And I was failing in the eyes of the Prophet Muhammad, who was also watching me. The Prophet Muhammad and God and all the angels, they're watching me sinning, being this lazy leech person who didn't do anything positive in life. And so this went on for years. And when the time came for me to finish 12th grade and go to university, my parents had decided I would go to university in Canada. And I was completely unprepared to do that. I felt like I don't want to move halfway across the world again to do some degree I don't care about, just so I can get a job I don't care about, just to make money, just so I can exist. And it all felt like all this busy work that I was just doing to stay alive, just to keep myself busy, occupied. And I couldn't see a way where I could find happiness with meeting a woman and getting married and having kids. And it felt so abstract and unattainable, because I remember thinking, well, I never talked to girls. I've never had a real girlfriend, and yet I'm supposed to magically find this woman who's going to be my soulmate, and everything is going to be good, and we're going to have a house, and life is going to be wonderful, and all that. The thing was, I didn't have a choice. My parents, to their credit, they didn't just listen to what their 16-year-old son wanted at the time. And so I just wanted to stay in Dubai, and I just wanted to do something at some school there, and I don't know, get some sort of job somewhere. It was really that big. I really wasn't interested in doing anything more than that. I was content to wallow and stay in bed all day and all night. And they said, no, you have to go. And they forced me to do all the stuff you have to do to apply to university. Fill out the forms, bullshit your essay about how you really want to attend to this university, get all your transcripts. And it was hard because I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. And part of that was because I was still very young. I was still only 16 at the time. But another part of it was because I didn't care that much about anything. I liked reading books and I liked history, but that isn't really much of a career, I guess. You could be a historian or something like that. And I'd always enjoyed writing, so I thought maybe I could be a novelist or a journalist. And I did some research into that, and I saw, well, being a novelist, being a journalist, these are dying fields and there isn't much money there. And so I thought, you know what? I'm just going to do what everybody else does. I'm just going to pick some lucrative career degree. I chose some business related thing. I picked marketing, and I just did it, and I got accepted. And so I guess it will be unsurprising to anyone watching, but my problems didn't magically disappear once I moved across the world to Canada. If anything, they came worse, because here I was, now I was 17, and living in Canada alone, living in a dorm, in a school in Toronto, in a university in Toronto, and my family wasn't there. Nobody there knew me, really. Nobody cared about me. And I remember when my parents left me, because they flew with me to Canada to help me set everything up, and then they just left. And the day they left, returned home, I had this moment of realization. I guess this is the kind of realization that happens when people lose their parents, perhaps both their parents die. I had this feeling that there's nobody who's there to watch over me anymore. And there's no one who cares about what I'm doing. I just have my parents who are thousands and thousands of kilometers away. And I could literally slit my wrists and die right now, and nobody will be even able to help me, to save me, because there's no one around. I could literally sleep in bed and skip all my classes, and no one would notice. No one would call up on me. No one would check in. And that was the toughest part of my life, because I really had to do things for myself, and I had to find my own motivation to do them because no one else was going to do it for me. And it wasn't always easy. There were a lot of days where I really had to force myself. And then there's also Canadian winters, especially if you're not used to them like I wasn't, because I've been living in Dubai where it's always warm and where the summers are 40 degrees Celsius or higher. If you're not used to them, Canadian winters are horrible. And so I was there alone, and the sun would be setting at 4:30 p.m. and it would be dark and cloudy and cold and snowy, and I didn't want to do anything. I couldn't even get the motivation to step outside into the cold, but I felt this obligation to my parents they helped me come here to Canada, and they sacrificed a lot to pay for my tuition, which a lot of students weren't lucky enough to have. So I owed it to them to at least try to keep passing my courses. And so that's how I motivated myself for school. But in terms of a social life or for anything like that, I did the bare minimum. I do some things here and there, but I never really consistently did anything. And things were just not getting better. I was getting suicidal thoughts all the time, and I'd think about how easy it would be to give up, and I'd think about all the different ways I could kill myself. I think maybe I could jump in front of a subway train, but I had a part-time job at the time, and my boss told me about how he knew, I didn't tell him I wanted to kill myself, but the subject came up and he told me about how he knew someone who jumped in front of a train and lived. He didn't die, but he was mangled, horribly injured. And I thought, okay, well, the subway train suicide is not the way I want to go out. And so I'd start thinking about other ways. And I'd think, oh, maybe there's a way of going to the roof of my dorm building and then I can just jump off. It would be awful while I was falling, but then the moment of impact, it would be over. And I realized that was probably the best way to do it and the least painful way to do it. And so clearly, as you can tell, I wasn't in a very good mind space. And I didn't really talk to anyone about this besides my mother, who I talked about it on MSN, if anyone remembers MSN from my generation. So most of it I just bottled in, and with my mother, it would be these repeated conversations that I usually had in my head that revolved around how I hated myself and how there was no point to all the things I was doing. And around this time, I guess it was a natural process where I began deconstructing everything in my life, because I was spending way too much time alone with myself and spending way too much time alone with my thoughts. So I deconstructed everything. I deconstructed everything to try motivating myself to do them. So what's the point of going to school? Well, because you have to do this to get a job and make money. And then I'd ask myself, why do you need money? Because society is controlled, dictated by money. And these were thought loops that would be going on and on in my head for everything. And I struggled to care about it all, even though I could justify them in my mind. But I had to do it because that's what everyone around me was telling me to do. And I think this process of deconstructing everything finally hit Islam. At this point, I wasn't eating pork, I wasn't drinking alcohol, I was still fasting for Ramadan, and that was pretty much it. I pray every now and then, but not consistently and not as much as I was supposed to be doing. And when it came to the subject of Islam, I realized something. Well, this religion isn't helping me. It supposedly had all the answers that I was looking for, the answers for the questions that were troubling me. What is the meaning of life? Worshipping God, submitting to God and His will, and obeying His commands. Why am I here? Because God created me and because He loves me. And what is the purpose of my life? To do good so I can go to paradise and be with Him. So, in a nutshell, there, Islam offered all the answers, and I'd known these answers my whole life, and yet it didn't satisfy me. And I started thinking, why doesn't it satisfy me? What is this thing that's missing in Islam that isn't connecting with me? Since my childhood, and this is something that transcends just Islam, it actually applies to a lot of things since my childhood. I always felt like if I didn't believe in something properly or I didn't do it properly, then the lack was in me. I wasn't doing it properly or I didn't see it the right way. And that applied to school or activities or whatever it was that people said were important. So I had to adjust myself to what this thing was. I was a bad Muslim because I wasn't trying hard enough, because I was lazy, because I was a sinner. I wasn't doing well in school because I was lazy and because I wasn't good at motivating myself. I wasn't ambitious or motivated to do things in life because, again, I'm lazy and I don't care, and I'm just this lazy sinner who wants to have everything be easy and all that. And so obviously the problem is with me. And the next thing from there is obviously that I should be listening to what others around me are telling me to do because they've got their shit together. And so I'm supposed to do this stuff in university. I'm supposed to be Muslim. And that's when I started questioning that supposed to aspect. Why am I supposed to be Muslim? Why is this the thing that is supposed to be guiding me in life? Why are its answers not working for me? Maybe, just maybe, the problem isn't with me. Maybe the problem is with the religion. And once I switched the order of that question around and I switched the accusation away from me, and I was always first to accuse myself, as I was often mired in self-loathing. But once I shifted it away from me to Islam, that's really when my perspective on the religion and my faith started to drastically change. And I started to think, how do I know that Islam even is true? And I thought about it. Well, everyone around me told me it was true. And I started thinking, well, I've never seen God. I think I felt him. I think I felt the Muslim equivalent of the Christian Holy Spirit. I think there's an afterlife. And I asked myself, why do I think those things? And I couldn't think of anything better as an answer than, well, because everyone around me believes it, and that's what they tell me. When you look on social media these days, there's a lot of Muslims that will go at you with logical arguments or the evidence in the Quran and the Hadith that prove in their minds that this couldn't have been man-made. It had to come from the creator of the universe. But that's not really why I believed. I'd heard stories and examples of evidence in the Quran. I heard how there's all these numerical miracles in the Quran, for example, but it was supplementary to the core belief that, of course, we come from God, which I've been told ever since I was a little kid. Everything around me couldn't have come from nothing. And you just look at the trees, you look at the beauty of the mountains, you look at the ocean, look at how everything in this world works in this harmonious way. Look at the intricacy of your body, the complexity. Of course, this couldn't have just happened. That's why it had to come from God. And this life, well, it can't just be meaningless, nothingness. Imagine if this life was, you just lived for, I don't know, 60, 70, 80 years, and then you died, and that was it. So serial killers just get to kill people, and then that's it. So Islam made sense in this very fundamental way. Of course, there has to be a reason for all this. And of course, that reason has to be good. And I thought, well, why? Why does everything have to have a meaning to it? Why is the ultimate foundation of everything good? Why does there have to be something more than this life? It didn't hit me overnight, but it gradually developed in my mind that, wait, what if these things are made up stuff from people and it's just wishful thinking? People face incredible suffering in this life, much worse suffering than anything I ever faced. And there's all these things happening and they don't make sense, like people getting cancer or natural disasters destroying entire communities, good people dying suddenly from aneurysms at a young age, or heart attacks, or stillborn babies. And it's all happening for no reason. Hitler or whoever, he's not going to be punished for all the sins, all the evils he committed. No, there has to be a God. There has to be a meaning to all this. And we can't just cease to exist, or else what is this life? There has to be a record of what we're doing, and there has to be someone caring for us and someone who sees those little good things we do that no one else sees, those little deeds or those positive, loving things we think in our heads. And we want to know that there's someone else there who listens, who understands, who feels our pain and will compensate our pain with something good. And I thought, what if all this was not true? Maybe it is true, but is there a good reason to believe that it's true? And I just couldn't see it. I just couldn't see it anywhere. I couldn't see God around me. I couldn't see paradise, heaven. I couldn't see the jinn, the spirits that lived in another dimension. I couldn't see the angels, the demons. I couldn't see anything. And the supposed day of judgment that's supposed to happen, well, I started thinking about how there's always been wars. There's always been droughts. There's always been all sorts of catastrophes. And I remembered from the stuff that I'd learned in history, just reading history books, well, if you look at any era, people thought that the apocalypse was coming. The people who went through the Cold War, people in World War II, people in World War I, you keep going back and there's always this feeling of impending doom. Look at the Black Plague, for example, the Black Death. And I thought, what if this religion stuff and this Day of Judgment stuff is humanity's coping mechanism? So I didn't think that, okay, I know this for sure is all man-made, it's all bullshit, but it did open the door to doubt, to skepticism. And I thought, what if Islam isn't true? What if there isn't a God? What if he doesn't exist? When I thought about that, the world was very different to me. It felt chaotic, cold, alien, meaningless. So in that sense, the doubts didn't help me come out of my crisis, at least initially, because then my thoughts were, well, if there's no God, then fuck it all. Let me just go in a corner and die. Maybe I should just kill myself, because now when I kill myself, I don't have to worry about God punishing me for killing myself, because that's another sin. So you can't escape this life that was forced upon you by God, because this life is a gift that you're forced to take. So I thought, without this God, then there really is no incentive for me to live. And I'm really just doing things for my own sake and to perpetuate my sad, little, miserable existence. And yet I still found myself wanting to live. I still found myself enjoying the little things I enjoyed, whether it was watching a soccer game or playing a silly little video game or chatting to a cute girl or whatever it was. I still wanted those things. I still enjoyed learning some of the stuff I learned in school. It wasn't all bad or boring. And I still laughed at jokes. And even though I now had all these doubts about Islam, yet I still enjoyed those things. It didn't go away. And so I thought, well, what does that mean? And I thought, maybe I don't need those things of Islam to live my life, all those beliefs of an afterlife and so on and so forth. And that's when I started exploring atheist content, stuff that was being put out there by increasingly popular books written by atheists. And it was around this time that the whole Four Horsemen movement of Christopher Hitchens and Daniel Dennett and Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris was getting prominent in the mainstream. So we're now around 2007. And I read Sam Harris's End of Faith, Hitchens' God is Not Great, Dawkins' The God Delusion. And I would often watch this HBO show called Real Time with Bill Maher. It's an HBO show that's a talk show where Bill Maher, who's a comedian, interviews panelists from the world of politics, but also often celebrities or people from all these different walks of life. And so Bill Maher was a comedian, but he was also an atheist, and religion was a common theme in his comedy. And I started watching a lot of his clips on YouTube where he made fun of religion and questioned its teachings. And he even made a documentary about it. And I thought, well, okay, clearly I'm not alone in feeling all this stuff is iffy or lacking in substance. And I thought, if Bill Maher felt this way and he's this adult, or Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins or whoever, there's probably more people around me that feel the exact same way. And so there were other comedians like George Carlin or Ricky Gervais who all talked about these doubts, these problems with religion, even though they were mostly talking about Christianity. And sure, they were not Muslim, but they're saying the same things that I was thinking about Islam. There's a God, but where is he? Why is he hiding? What's the point of this life where we try to get into paradise and avoid hell? And that's when I realized as well that the answers that Islam offers that didn't really comfort me in my existential crisis, well, they weren't really answers. They were basically answering the big mysteries of life by appealing to even bigger mysteries. So the questions I asked earlier that Islam supposedly answers: why do we exist? Because God created us. Well, let's take it further. Why did he create us? Because he wanted to. Why did God want to? Because he wants to be worshipped. Why does God want to be worshipped? Because that's just the way God is. So just accept it. And that's kind of the thing that happened with all the other fundamental questions about God. What is the meaning of life? To please God. Why? Because that's what God wants. Why? Because that's just what God wants. So even within Islamic teachings, you just hit this brick wall each time with this mystery God. And it's unclear why he's doing any of this. And based on what I was taught, it was irrelevant why he was doing this, because that's the way it is. And you're supposed to just accept it and trust in God, knowing what's best for you because, he's God. And so I just felt at that point in my life, no, I want to know the answers. And Islam is not giving the answers. Probably because the Muslims who came up with this stuff, the Muslims who were the first Muslims that I once admired, don't know the answers. Islam is just claiming to know the answers and saying, trust in this God figure. This God figure that I couldn't see anywhere around me, and yet I was told existed everywhere. When you're born into Islam and you're taught that this is the only thing that there really is, you're not really equipped with the tools to scrutinize Islam or address questions about it. I definitely wasn't when I was a kid, when I was a practicing Muslim, because I accepted whatever Mr. Muhammad, my first Islamic teacher, and Mr. Muhammad, my second Islamic teacher, told me. I accepted whatever my parents told me. And I never looked at anything through a critical lens when it came to Islam, even when it didn't make sense, or even if there were contradictory things I was being taught. Like the example I mentioned earlier, I was so unclear on whether people would go to hell for a little while or if anyone qualified to go to hell forever, because I heard contradictory things about that. And I felt, well, it's because I'm ignorant and I don't understand. And obviously, there's a true, logical, accurate answer that's correct and valid somewhere. And it is tough because when you encounter other people doubting things that are so fundamental to you and your way of life, I think it's human nature that your reaction will be antagonistic, because if you start letting in the doubt into your life as well, then for Muslims, the underpinning of your life is Islam. That was the underpinning of my life. If you take that away, you take away that foundation, and you have to find something to replace it, or else it's just this bare, cold, and meaningless universe. Without Islam, how do you know what's good? Without Islam, how do you know what to do in life? What guides your morality? Without Islam, morality becomes a vague man made thing. And to go back to my feelings about Islam, I think that's one of those things where Islam promises us things because the reality is harder to accept. And reality doesn't fit into neat little boxes like good and bad. So I opened myself to the possibility that maybe morality is this flexible thing that changes. And that made sense when I looked at, again, the things I'd learned from history. Rape used to be accepted in a lot of cultures. Owning slaves used to be fine in a lot of cultures. In Islamic culture, it used to be fine owning slaves. You'll find Muslims defending or rationalizing that nowadays, but it's definitely a fact that slavery was accepted in the time of the Prophet Muhammad and long after. And now it's seen as one of the most inhumane things you can do. So morality does change, and that's scary to people because they feel like, well, if it changed before, then the thing I believe now is good or bad could change in the future. And as uncomfortable as that is, I saw that this appeared to be reality, the reality around me. And I really had to open myself up to those possibilities as I was navigating myself out of my crisis and away from Islam. As for the influence of Muslims around me during this time period, I didn't have that many friends in university, especially in the first 2 years, but the few friends I did have were Muslim. My roommate my first year was Muslim, and I wouldn't say we were best friends or anything like that, but he was a friend, and a few other people in my circle were Muslim. And they were the kind of lax, lazy Muslims that I was. So they didn't pray very often either, and some of them even drank alcohol and had sex with their girlfriends outside of marriage. And of course, I had my judgment hat on towards them again to deflect my own feelings of inadequacy. And funnily enough, one of my best friends in my first couple years of university, who wasn't Muslim when I first met him, converted to Islam after I met him. So he had converted and became really gung ho about it. And I actually even taught him how to pray. And at that point, when I was teaching him how to pray, I was really disillusioned with Islam. So he told me he had this spiritual experience where he realized that Islam has to be the truth. And this experience was very vague, basically a feeling that came over him one day. And he told me how he wanted to find a good Muslim woman and marry her and use Islam to guide him in life. So understandably, our relationship didn't last. It kind of fizzled out over the next few years. So when I was still Muslim and questioning Islam, most of my friends were Muslim. It would be awkward sometimes, especially when I was really transitioning away from Islam, where I'd hear a Muslim friend say something that was very homophobic or transphobic, and I would stay silent because I wanted to avoid the awkward conversation. Now, that's something I wish I hadn't done and I wouldn't do today. I would actually confront them and say something if that ever happened now. And as I gradually left, those relationships kind of went away, and I started gravitating towards similar minded people who, for the most part, were atheists. I didn't have any religious friends in my last 2 years of university when I finally accepted to myself that I was an atheist. Now, one of the other things I realized as I was doubting Islam was, well, this is just like the perfect system to keep people believing in obedience because you have this invisible, all powerful God who's watching all you do and who has complete, perfect control over you. So obviously, you're going to be motivated to obey him. And so you have the carrot of the eternal paradise dangling for you as your reward for doing the things that you're supposed to do. But if you're bad and you're naughty and you disobey, if you leave the religion, then there's this eternal hell for you to be stuck in. And if you can't see this paradise and hell, well, you can't disprove them now, can you? But they're there. They're there. And so I saw how hell was this perfect scare tactic since no one comes back from death to validate if it's true or not. And so I think that in of itself is something that kept me believing and keeps so many people believing, especially when they're taught a religion at a young age. There is that desire for paradise and fear of hell, but there's also this fear of the unknown. Now, what would you rather face? Well, I didn't know what happens after death. Maybe there was nothing and there was no meaning to it all. Or there's this God and he cares about us and we just have to do the right thing, the good things, and we go to paradise, we go to heaven. And I could obviously see how that second option would sound more appealing to the vast majority of people, especially if they're raised to believe that second option. But that didn't make that second option automatically true. So for me, it was a challenge to get over that because to leave Islam, I had to embrace a reality that wasn't all cheery and bright and happy, although it had less of the ugly repercussions that come with the Islamic theology like hell. So, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of my existential crisis was internal. All these thoughts, overthinking about every aspect of my life. Why do I want to meet people? Why am I interested in this? I just put everything under this intense microscope. So I didn't talk about it with anyone else except sometimes my mother or other people in my family. I figured others didn't care or it would bore and annoy them because it definitely bored and annoyed me, let me tell you. And in retrospect, I think I had to do it that way so I could figure things out for myself. It likely would have taken less time if I talked to a therapist or was open with my feelings with other people, but I think it did benefit me in the long run because for me right now today, I'd say there's no idea, no thought that could truly shake me to my core because I've already put myself through every possible conceivable, horrifying, troubling, upsetting idea possible about myself and about the people and the world around me. And that being said, when it came to my parents, I gradually and carefully would drop little hints that I was having these doubts about Islam. I'd tell them a joke about Islam, or I'd mention something that didn't make sense to me about Islam. And they seemed pretty receptive overall. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. And in a way, it did make sense to me because I always felt, well, my parents are these terrible, sinful, lazy Muslims. So maybe they're not opposed to me criticizing it because they're not devout. But I still wanted to figure it out for myself. So that's when I started exploring Islam more deeply. And I started looking into the evidence for it. So I've already talked about some things like the appeal to ignorance when answering the question of where did everything come from? Well, it had to come from God because everything can't come from nothing. And I can't think of where else it could have come from. So God wasn't a real answer, it was a dead end, a bigger mystery. So I looked into the Quran, which is supposed to be a miracle. I looked into the Hadith and how it's supposed to be this repository dispensing amazing knowledge, amazing insights into life and how to live life. And I just couldn't see good arguments for how any of this was actually good evidence for the truth of Islam. So the Quran is supposed to be a miracle because no human could have written it. And there's the famous challenge in the Quran from God saying, in the Quran itself, I challenge someone to write one chapter, one surah that's as good as any in the Quran. And of course, according to Islamic tradition, every human being that tried failed. And that's what I was taught in school, that writing something as good as a chapter in the Quran is impossible, that people tried and people failed. But I started to think about it a bit. How was this test assessed? And what is being assessed exactly? So this chapter has to match the beauty and the literary perfection of the Quran, supposedly, which couldn't have been man-made. But how exactly do you know something wasn't man-made? And if you did manage to determine that it wasn't man-made, then who made it? Excluding human beings doesn't necessarily mean it could only come from the creator of the universe. So, for example, you couldn't rule out that it was written by super intelligent and advanced aliens that are just messing with us. It sounds absurd, and it sounded absurd to me at the point of time too, but I realized that we as Muslims couldn't actually rule out super advanced aliens messing with us unless we just use blind faith to say if it isn't man made, well, it has to be from the creator of the universe. Aside from that, I thought, how can you judge the literary perfection or beauty of something like the Quran? Isn't that subjective? And what is perfection when it comes to words or a book anyway? Is it that something conveys the meaning it's supposed to in the least amount of words possible and the least amount of letters? Is that really beauty, or is that just mechanical efficiency? Or was it something else? I couldn't figure it out. And can you even say something that is a work of art, something that is words, a book, uh, is perfect anyway? Uh, this is something that is entirely subjective. And I won't go into a lot of other examples, but I did the same kind of thing with all the other supposed proofs that the Quran couldn't have been man made, scientific miracles or fulfilled prophecies. And I reached the same conclusion that, well, how do we really know that this leads and can only lead to the Islamic God being true? Could it be possible that using them as evidence is just the result of all these Muslims poring over the Quran, reading its pages over and over and over again for hundreds and hundreds of years, looking for anything that they could say is a fulfilled prophecy to boost their own faith? Then obviously you're going to find something in a long enough book guiding you through life and sharing all these ancient stories. The same could be said with supposed scientific facts in the Quran or with the numerical miracles that are supposedly in it. So I imagined that it had to be something that came from Muslims filling their days counting the number of times words like paradise and hell are mentioned. And their conclusion was if paradise and hell are mentioned the same exact number of times, boom, it's a miracle. It has to be from God because a human couldn't possibly do that and it couldn't possibly be a coincidence. Sure. And the reason I didn't want to go too into the weeds of all this stuff in this video is because these proofs of the Quran indicating that Islam is true have the same problem. Even if we accept it, that all these things are true, so the fulfilled prophecies are correct, these numerical miracles are miracles and they couldn't just be coincidences, and we've somehow concluded that they're beyond the capability of a human to do. Okay, let's accept that all these things are true. Why is the natural conclusion then that it has to be from God, the creator of the universe? All we can really say is we don't know how it came to be. They don't prove that everything else in the book or the religion is true. Just because there's a fulfilled prophecy in the Quran or a couple of correct scientific details, that doesn't make the whole book and all of its claims true. It makes those prophecies and scientific claims true, sure, but that's about it. And I saw that this captured the mentality of Muslims who want to believe and have indoctrinated children like me into becoming believers like them. I understood that we Muslims don't start from a skeptical position, a doubting position of, I'm not going to believe until I'm convinced by evidence, and this evidence is so compelling that I am now a believer. It works the other way around with Muslims. They start with, I believe in Islam, so now I'm going to look wherever I can to find the evidence that fits and supports my belief, and that evidence has to exist because Islam has to be true. And I eventually saw that this was the problem with a lot of the apologetics of Muslims and Christians alike, where they clearly start with this bias where they need to believe and they need to find the things that fit their beliefs because they're already sold. So they're not trying to find things that are actually good pieces of evidence. They're just trying to find things that will comfort them in being right about their beliefs, which I would say is very, very different. So, beyond these kinds of evidence, I also found out about other arguments I'd never heard of when I was living in the Middle East, like the Kalam cosmological argument popularized by Christian apologists in the West, like William Lane Craig. And this argument essentially says that everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, so the universe must have a cause, and that cause is God. So this was a more sophisticated thing than the everything can't come from nothing. There has to be a God. But now I had enough understanding to see how this was filled with assumptions. Assumptions about a universe we barely understood. Did everything that begins to exist have a cause? Did we know for sure that the universe had a starting point? And of course, the biggest assumption, how did Muslims or Christians determine that their version of God was the one who was this cause of the universe and not all the other gods that others outside their religion believed in? Beyond that, what if none of our gods was the actual creator of the universe, if this creator even existed in the first place? So, what if it was a God that we hadn't discovered yet? And how do we know who's right and who's wrong? We don't. So, it's just this bias. And once I got rid of the bias for myself, my faith was irreversibly shaken. When I reflected on the feeling of peace and connection with God that I had when I prayed and did the things God told me to do, what if I only felt that way because I was indoctrinated to feel good when I obeyed the commands of this invisible God? And I saw then that there was nothing to hold up my faith besides bad evidence and wishful thinking, a hope deep inside me that this world is not just a meaningless existence, humans floating in space in a big, uncaring universe. It sounded really bleak, and that is a bleak way of looking at the world. Well, I decided then and there that if I'm going to lead my life the way I want to lead my life, I have to accept reality for what I see it as, for what the world around me is. I can't escape into fantasies or hopes that there's something different or something better, because that would be cheating myself out of this only life that I have. So at this point, I stopped believing that I had an afterlife to look forward to. I stopped believing that if my parents were murdered, that there would be God's justice for their murder in the afterlife if the killer was never caught in this life. I stopped believing that if I had some kind of tragic, horrible accident, that it had some purpose or meaning behind it. All these things could be true. There could be a purpose and some sort of divine justice in an afterlife. But it didn't make sense to act as if they did anymore until I actually saw some proof that they did. Part of this acceptance was an acknowledgement to myself that I was more fortunate than others because I hadn't had that many bad things happen to me in life. So perhaps I didn't need faith in God as much as others did. But I still had to accept that I'm going to die, and for all I knew, I had no reason to think otherwise, that I would just cease to exist. And it still upsets me now, every now and then, to be honest. Thinking about not existing anymore and knowing that everything that I ever was and that everyone who ever knew me would cease to exist as well, like we all were never there, it was depressing. But what helped me was changing my perspective. Instead of thinking about how this is sad, this is bad, everything around me will go away, so it all doesn't matter, I just looked at it as, this is all I have. This is all I'm gonna get. So what do I want to do? Do I want to wallow and wish that there was something better, or be sad that there isn't something more, or that, life continues, or that I get to exist forever, or whatever it is, or that there's a God who cares about me? Did I want to sink back into a fantasy about a God who loves me and will make everything better? No, I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to lie to myself. It felt like I would be cheating myself out of a genuine existence, and I couldn't do it. And so I decided I want to make the most out of my life. Again, this is the only life I have. So I'm going to go out there and try to get what I can and try to make the world a better place, because that's what makes me feel good. Not because God tells me to, but because I see the suffering of the people around me and it hurts me. And it feels good to do good things. It feels good to create things. I started remembering all the things that I loved doing that I had neglected for years. I loved writing and creating and reading and playing soccer, and I wanted to go back to all of those things. And I didn't want to lose them because I cared about them. These were things that even in my lowest moments, I never lost my love for them. I just lost my motivation for doing them. And instead of thinking, well, nobody's going to ever read this book of mine that I wrote, or no one's going to remember my name, and even if I fall in love with someone and have kids with her, she's going to die, I'm going to die, my kids are going to die, and then that's it. I thought, no, I have the opportunity to create something. I have the opportunity to, let's say, write this book and to express myself, or do this YouTube channel later on down the road. I'm getting the opportunity to meet someone to fall in love with and to share time and experiences together. And all this is better than nothing because I was born. I'm here. I'm alive. I didn't have a choice in being born, but here I am. I exist. And I care about all these things, and I want to make the world a better place. Once my faith went away, then I saw that many of the restrictions Islam had in it were either draconian or they just didn't make sense. Why not eat pork? Now, perhaps that did make sense 1400 years ago when Islam was first created, because eating pork came with a high risk of illness and could even kill you. But does it really matter today when pork is much safer to eat? It just doesn't make sense to outright condemn something like that forever. Why can there not be sex before or outside marriage? Because it's a sin and tears apart the fabric of society? Does it? Really? I'm not saying that sex is always a good thing in every scenario. Obviously, it isn't. But to institute a blanket rule that sex must be within the confines of marriage and only between a man and a woman, and to say that people who violate this rule are sinning and risking going to hell, it's ridiculously controlling of something that is an important, crucial part of us. And that's probably why it's so controlling. And I think about all the people who are shamed for who they are because they happen to be part of the LGBTQ community. Because this religion says they're sinning, because these people are sinners, because they're committing an abomination, I could never find another reason, a practical explanation of why things like homosexuality were sins. What exactly made them bad besides God not liking them? I really changed my mindset on the subject and let go of my own homophobia once I came into contact with LGBTQ people in Canada and saw, well, they were people just like me. And actually, a little before I moved to Canada, what started my change of perspective on this was watching the Hollywood movie Brokeback Mountain. And it's a movie about two closeted gay cowboys. And the reason I watched it was because it was getting all this Oscar buzz, and I was curious because I was very movie obsessed at the time. And of course, it wasn't playing in movie theaters in Dubai where I was still living, but I managed to pirate it, to torrent it, and I watched it. And when I saw all the struggles and suffering that those two characters went through, the double lives they had to lead, the desires they suppressed, it helped me understand that these people were not mentally ill or evil. They couldn't help who they were attracted to. And it seemed so incredibly harsh to condemn them as sinners for something that felt natural to them and that was out of their control. If they're not harming anyone, especially, why can't they just do that? Because this religion says so. So even if I didn't believe Islam was true, I didn't want to follow it anymore because it had all these rules and commands that didn't make sense or were so cruel. And once I let it go, I was able to focus on the things that actually mattered to me and that were there for me throughout my life without Islam. And I thought at one point, that Islam was all that I was or a core part of my identity. And to my surprise, When I finally let it go, I found out that I'm still this person. I'm still me. I still care about these things and I still want to live my life. And all these years later, I still feel the same way. And because of this journey of leaving, I couldn't move to another religion like Christianity, for example. I knew that's a thing that happens with a lot of people where they're unhappy with Islam because they still want the things that the religion that they left offered them, which for most people is community and guidance in life. And so I mentioned before my friend who found Islam when I left it. So he went from Christianity to Islam, and there's a lot of people who go from Islam to Christianity, and there's a lot of people who go from those religions to Buddhism or other religions. But for me, they all essentially have the same problem of not having good evidence for them. They seem to be built on those same foundations that Islam is, of wishful thinking and a hope for a divine meaning to life that we don't know for sure exists. So that doesn't mean that there is no meaning to life. I think we create our own meaning, and actually that we fill religions with the meanings that we create as human beings. So we don't need those religions to create that meaning for ourselves. And so even though I didn't have Islam anymore, leading a good life was still important to me. And for all the Muslims who might say to me at this point, well, you're now just following the morality of the moment, and you're now simply seeking pleasures of this world, pleasures of materialism and sex and whatever it is, and you don't have an objective eternal foundation to guide you. I do have something to say. So, what I would say is, we as humans, no matter what era we live in a specific context. I live in this context of this present day and age. If I lived 500 years ago, I would be a completely different person with very different beliefs. And the same would be true of you watching. And in this context that I'm in, I'm trying to live my life in the way that I and many others see as the best way possible. And it's not just because a lot of people are following it, it's universal beliefs that make sense and that have positive benefits. Things like caring about other human beings, wanting to be around other humans, wanting to find love, wanting to find happiness. These things aren't universal in the sense that they're eternal or come from a divine source, as far as I can tell anyway, but they are universal to us as human beings. And those are the things that I realized have always been most important to me. And they don't need a God. They don't need to be expressed through Islam. So even if at the end of it all, it turned out that there was a God, whether it's the Islamic God or some other creator God, because I guess I can't say 100% sure that there isn't one. I'm comfortable in stating to whoever that God is, if I can communicate with that God, if they want to punish me or not, that I went into this life with the mind that you gave me. And if it's specifically the Islamic God, I tell him that I'd use my mind to leave Islam based on what I saw around me and how I thought and felt. And I just didn't see the good evidence. I just didn't see the good evidence for Islam in order to stay a Muslim. And if this God still punished me because of that, then we're in a hellish situation anyway, because this God is a complete moral monster. And this monstrous reality is what Islam teaches: an invisible, hiding God that's dictating to us what is good and what is wrong, and is dangling paradise and hell in front of us. Now, that's a despicable deity, especially when he didn't need to create us, because he's supposedly all powerful and self sufficient if you follow Islamic teachings. He just did it. What Muslims will say is God wants to test us. Now, that's something I've heard my entire life, and especially when I was Muslim. But why does God test us? Because without that test, things would be boring for him? I don't know. That's when you get into the whole free will argument, that God wants us to worship him with our free will because that's better than the worship of people who don't have free will. But why does that matter to him? Does he need our freely chosen worship? Once again, no, he doesn't if you follow Islamic teachings. He just did it. And again, like I mentioned before, you hit that dead end. He just did it, and that's all you should know. It makes no sense to me that God would create all of this and then withhold truly convincing proof of his existence to test us, unless he was some sort of sadistic entity that is looking to mess with us, especially when he already knows what we're going to do because he's all knowing and he created everything. So, in that sense, we don't have true free will, anyways, because we're only going to be able to do what he knows what we're going to do. So, the Islamic version of reality is what's truly horrifying, not the one without God's objective justice and without an afterlife. But it took a long time to be able to finally say that to myself. So, to any ex Muslims who are watching this or people who are debating leaving the religion, I'm not saying it's easy to leave it. It was one of the hardest, most challenging things I ever had to do. But it's worthwhile in the end because then you live honestly and you live for yourself and the human beings around you, instead of assigning all that is important to a God you can't see or experience. Now that I was no longer Muslim, did I immediately go out and have a ton of casual, unprotected sex and join wild orgies in nightclubs? After all, isn't that what imams often claim tempts young men to leave Islam in the West? Well, no. I didn't go out and do those things. Because I'd compartmentalized my sexuality for so long, keeping it as something that I did by myself in secret, it took years for me to get over the shame and guilt around expressing my sexuality. Communicating that I had sexual interest in a woman still felt wrong. It was like I was revealing a weakness in myself. And so I mostly avoided doing it long after I left Islam. Because Islam connected sex and sexual desire with shame for my entire childhood, I couldn't just flip the switch and look at those things as normal when I'd spent so much time hiding those desires. In that way, I'd say those Islamic teachings stunted me, and for a lot of my 20s, it felt like I was behind other non-religious people of my age who'd been dating and in relationships since they were young teenagers. I wanted to have those experiences not because I wanted to have casual, meaningless sex for the sake of my own pleasure, as Muslims warned me happened in the West, but because I felt disconnected from a core part of myself. I didn't know what building a relationship with a woman was like, what I would even want from women, because all I knew was from things like unrealistic movies or my Islamic teachings about marriage and tradition and children. The best template I had was my parents, who trusted and respected each other as partners, but there's a difference between seeing what others are doing and building a good relationship yourself. For example, did I even want marriage and kids like my parents and many others did? I wasn't sure, and I felt like I had to make up for lost time. And so, inevitably, my first few sexual encounters were awkward or pursuing the wrong kind of person. And there was a long phase of figuring out who the right kind of person was and what I wanted exactly. And so I didn't have a serious relationship until I was in my mid 20s, which is when I'd say I finally started letting go of the shame and embarrassment I had about sex. The next thing I wanted to just talk about, and this is the thing that I would say makes me more privileged than most ex Muslims, and that made my journey of leaving Islam much easier than it was for others, is that when I finally told my parents, and I think I was around 19 at the time, and I left Islam when I was 18, when I finally told them that I'm an atheist, that I don't believe in Islam anymore, and that I think Islam is actually pretty harmful in all sorts of ways. It made me homophobic. It gave me all this shame about my sexuality, and it made me judgmental of other people, of other faiths, and of other Muslims. And I said, I don't believe it in any of it anymore. They were actually very accepting. And it was over the next few years that I realized why they were so accepting. And this is something that they concealed for the most part. Obviously, not very well, because throughout my childhood, I noticed that they were not very good Muslims. The reason why they were so accepting of me leaving Islam and being an atheist was that they weren't religious either. And what they had decided to do when raising my brother and I was they were going to tell us that we were Muslim and they were going to tell us about God, but they were not going to force it upon us and they were going to let us learn for ourselves. So all that time when I noticed them not doing anything that they were supposed to do as Muslims, they weren't doing them because they just weren't really into it. They weren't practicing Muslims. They just didn't want to tell me or my brother because they didn't want to affect my choice. And I have to be honest, when my mother first explained that to me, I was angry at them. I was angry at my parents because instead of taking an active role as my parents in my religious upbringing, which is what I would say when you're taught a religion like Islam is one of the most important things in your life, you'd expect them to. They allowed the teachers in my school, the first Mr. Muhammad and the second Mr. Muhammad, to fill my head with all the stuff about hell and punishment and sin and the day of judgment. They filled my brother's head with all this stuff. And it reached a point where when my parents would tell me, don't worry about hell, God loves you and you're a good person, I wouldn't believe them because I felt I was a better Muslim than them, and Mr. Muhammad in school was a better Muslim than them, and they didn't know that much about Islam anyway. They don't even know how to pray. So why should I listen to them, even though I listen to them for everything else in life? So I thought I should listen to Mr. Muhammad at school, the one who's warning me about all these hellish things that are going to happen to me if I don't do the right thing. And I think that their lack of taking an active role, or at least a balancing role in my Islamic upbringing, caused a lot of problems for me that could have been avoided. So like I mentioned, a balancing role where you teach some things, but you don't drill it down their throats. But I think that's something that religious people are terrified of doing, especially if they, one, really believe that there's a hell and their kids might go to it if they become disbelievers or sinners, or two, they're worried about how it will reflect on the family and reflect on them if their kids become atheists, especially if you live in a tight-knit Muslim community out here in the West, in a country like Canada that I'm in right now, or even worse, in a Muslim country. And that second element also is what my parents explained to me. So we were living in the United Arab Emirates, a Muslim country, and they said, we didn't want you going to school and talking about how there is no God or things like that, because that could have caused all sorts of problems, not just for me with my classmates. It might have caused problems for my parents. We were, after all, living in a Muslim country. So I understood why they did it, although I still do wish to this day that they had taken more of that active balancing role that I was talking about. To tell me it's okay to not believe in God. It's okay if you choose another path, because I felt like I had no other choice but Islam. For most Muslim families, whether they're devout or non-practicing, teaching your kids you can choose another path besides Islam is scary to do. And it's scary to do that because it comes with all these repercussions. That's how Islam and other religions operate. They intertwine themselves in the culture, in the fabric of the society, where it becomes shocking to leave, where the social ramifications beyond the spiritual ones are devastating. And I think that's the reason why so many people, especially in this day and age, with all the information we have at our disposal, at our fingertips, that expose the problems with Islam, that expose the problems of Christianity and other religions, they're still religious. Sure, there's an aspect of it where people want something to believe in now in this rapidly changing and confusing world. They want to have faith in something that's, greater than themselves. But there's also that fear of what will happen to you if you don't follow that religion anymore. It's so embedded within our identities in many cases that doing so could cause death for a lot of people, and it does. Ex-Muslims get disowned, exiled, or even killed because they leave Islam. And that made me angry. So I was angry at my parents, but I was also angry at the world, the Muslim world to be specific, at all those Muslims in my life who helped indoctrinate me. The school where I was fed all these Islamic teachings, the Islamic education teachers who warped my mind and instilled this fear in me that I still didn't fully shake. It felt like a mass delusion, a mass normalized child abuse that the world didn't do anything about. I talked before about the good values Islam taught me. Things like modesty, honesty, generosity, bravery. But then there were those bad things: fear, guilt, shame, suppression, homophobia, judgment of people of other religions, misogyny. I'd recall all those odd things I'd been taught, like Mr. Muhammad announcing to the class in school that women entering the workforce was the cause of society's corruption, which even then felt strange and hypocritical because all my classmates and I were aware that his own wife taught the girls in our school. Was she exempted in his mind because she was teaching Islam? I don't know. But I think about how women had to endure wearing hijabs or niqabs or burqas, how they had to be burdened because of male attention and harassment. So instead of the focus being on men, men were treated like they just couldn't help being tempted if they saw a woman's hair or skin or legs or eyes. The onus was on the woman in this warped viewpoint of the world. I realized I'd gotten lucky. I didn't have to deal with the misogyny, the treatment of women as secondary to the man in the household and in many spheres of life because I was born male. My mother had never worn a hijab, and while that seemed like a result of her lazy Islam before, now I saw that she just didn't accept being controlled and forced to cover up because if she didn't, the implication was that she was immodest. She was not modest, and she was basically asking to be sexually harassed or even assaulted. And I admired her for not accepting that control. Now, this anger made me lash out, and it made me mock Muslims as ignorant sheep, as cruel monsters, and I felt more secure in this judgment and more righteous in this anger when I heard about things like honor killings of women in Muslim communities, of female genital mutilation to Muslim women like Ayaan Hirsi Ali famously experienced in order to curb women's sexual desire, or that Muhammad, the prophet I once revered and admired, did a lot of morally questionable things, with the most infamous example being his marriage to Aisha when she was 6 years old. But there were other acts of cruelty and brutality that seemed more like the actions of Sauron in Lord of the Rings than those of Gandalf. Things that, for very obvious reasons, didn't make the cut in Muhammad's life, in the Message, the Islamic propaganda movie I'd seen as a kid. I reveled in the religious mockery of atheist comedians. It felt so cathartic to see the things that had instilled so much fear and shame in me ridiculed. It was disarming those things. It was like rebelling against the power of those institutions. I had all this resentment in me whenever I saw Muslims preaching Islam in downtown Toronto, or if I drove by a mosque in the city. But eventually, I realized the limitations of that anger. On one visit to one of my religious relatives in the Middle East, I felt brazen enough to openly mock Muslims for fasting for Ramadan in the middle of a heat wave. There were Muslims in front of us who were really suffering because we were walking in the middle of the desert and they didn't have water to drink, or they couldn't drink water. And I just thought, well, these people are so stupid. Why are they doing this? And my cousin was offended. She could sense the cruelty and anger in my words, and she didn't understand it. I wasn't Muslim anymore, but I still felt what I was saying was wrong. That feeling this malice, this rage towards Muslims, served no good purpose. Muslims were victims of Islam, just like me, even if they were still indoctrinated and harming others through Islamic teachings they believed were right. If I felt they couldn't judge me for leaving Islam, how could I judge them? It wasn't an act of empathy. I used to be just like them. I had been a Muslim too. And it made me reflect on Mr. Muhammad, the second Mr. Muhammad, my Islamic education teacher, who caused me so much emotional suffering with his teachings. He was indoctrinated just like I was, and he truly believed what he was teaching was for my own good. Instead of judgment and anger, I just felt sympathy and overwhelming sadness. I decided to let go of all anger and resentment towards Muslims. I think a lot of ex Muslims have a similar angry phase after they leave Islam at some point. Now, it lasts a different duration depending on the person and what their experiences as a Muslim were and what the relationship is like with their family. There are some who never stop being angry, and while I'm not going to say that other ex Muslims shouldn't be angry, I know from my experience that this anger didn't serve me any good besides filling me with bitterness. Going back to my parents, years after I left Islam, my mother explained to me the other reasons she didn't share her skepticism about the truth of Islam when I was still growing up and living in Dubai. She worried that my brother and I were too young to process the repercussions of there not being a divine justice in the world where bad things happened, perhaps for no good reason, and people did bad things and they weren't punished. And that really stuck with me. This protective mentality comes from a place of love, but it's also placing your kids in a fantasy, a fantasy that has more consequences than withholding that Santa isn't real. That makes me think of something that I first heard from Matt Dillahunty, a prominent American atheist, ex-Christian, and some of you might recognize from his long stint as one of the hosts on the Atheist Experience call-in show, where he typically talked to Christians who were trying to prove their religion or criticize atheism. And he explained that leaving religious indoctrination is like this. It's like being promised you're going to get a large sum of money, let's say $10 million, and you're going to get this money when you turn 30, and you lead your whole life as if you're going to get this money later on when you turn 30. And so it inevitably impacts all your decisions, all your choices, because you're expecting this money. But then when you realize there is no money, in other words, when you lose/leave your faith, it's like a sucker punch. You feel like a fool, like you've been deceived, and you regret a lot of the choices you've made, and maybe even feel you've wasted your life. That's where the anger comes in too. But if you're never told the fantasy in the first place as a child, you can accept the world for what it is, and you never have expectations of something like an afterlife or a loving God in the first place. I have friends who are raised as atheists who don't have my fear of ceasing to exist because they never had an expectation that there was an afterlife. We underestimate what human beings are capable of accepting even when we're young. And by the way, a couple years after I left Islam, my younger brother also left, although for different reasons. For him, it was the problem of evil when you believe in a loving God. How could a loving God allow evil to happen? He'd watch the news and see the suffering of Palestinians from Israel's occupation. So video footage of bombed and bulldozed homes and dead bloody children being carried off in ambulances, and the whole illusion of Islam's God was shattered for him one day. There was no way in his mind that Islam's God could be real and allow this to happen. He didn't buy that these things were a test. For him, that explanation was indistinguishable from God wanting the suffering, being indifferent to the suffering, or simply not existing at all. And so while my parents didn't give us as much guidance as I hoped they would have when it came to the subject of Islam, they did give my brother and I a few things. The guidance, the tools that helped us leave. So those were things like the ability to think for ourselves, to trust in ourselves, although I didn't trust myself for such a long time. And in my case, to finally escape from being told by others what I should be doing in my life. whether it was following Islam or institutions like universities or society at large telling me what kinds of careers to pursue. So I ended up not even going into the career for the major I studied in university. As I mentioned earlier, I always loved writing, and so that's what I do now. I mean, I went into journalism, even though I knew it was, and it still very much is, a dying and struggling field. I figured I'd rather spend my life doing something I love to do rather than doing a job I was indifferent about or hated just so I could more easily earn $100,000 a year or more, whatever it happened to be. And that's the kind of mentality that I try to have in all aspects of my life today, where I want to do what feels right to me, even if it's not what most people around me are doing. And even if a lot of people don't approve, because I'm trusting in those universals I mentioned before, to care and connect with others, to find happiness and fulfillment in the abilities I have to bring people together. And that's the main reason why I started to go on social media to talk about my experiences of leaving Islam and how I came to find a secular spirituality of sorts that guides my life today and that gives my channel its name. The whole process started when I was in journalism school and I was assigned to write an article for one of the school magazines. And I was allowed to write the article on any subject I wanted. And I got this idea. What if I did a story on people who left Islam? At that point, I wasn't even aware of the term ex-Muslim until I discovered that there was such a thing as the ex-Muslims of North America support group. You never heard about ex-Muslims in the news, but I was sure many of them existed but had to hide because of fear. And sure enough, it was extremely hard to find willing interview subjects. Besides one brave ex-Muslim who posed for photos and willingly provided her name for publication in my article, the other ex-Muslims used pseudonyms and refused to be photographed. That whole process made me think, you know what? I have a responsibility here, an ability. I was capable of articulating the experience of leaving Islam, of explaining the problems of Islam that many were afraid of talking about. They were afraid of talking about it because it might harm their relationships in the case of ex-Muslims, or for non-Muslims because they'd be accused of Islamophobia and racism. And I didn't have to be as afraid. My immediate family knew I was an atheist and accepted me. I had a support network that other ex-Muslims didn't. I lived in Canada, not in the Middle East, and I wasn't deeply embedded in a Muslim community in Canada anyway, so I was safer too. But because of how fiercely Muslims defend Islam and attack those who criticize it, I decided I had to do my work anonymously. I was aware by then, of course, of how Salman Rushdie had to go into hiding after a fatwa was issued to kill him for blasphemy because of his book, The Satanic Verses. And I was aware of people who'd actually been murdered by Muslims for doing things that were offensive to Islam, with one example being the Charlie Hebdo cartoonists who were gunned down in France while I was in journalism school. I wasn't afraid of being murdered, but I was afraid that if I shared these thoughts and feelings of Muslims in my community and with the very religious members of my family, or if I shared it publicly, professionally, there could be all sorts of repercussions. And I wanted this outlet to be able to share because, like I said, a lot of people don't even have the capability to safely do that, to share even if it's anonymous, because of their family situation or because of where they happen to be living. And so I wanted to do it because if I didn't do it, I didn't know if there were many who would. Sure, there were other ex-Muslims who were doing this work online and who even had published books like Ali Rizvi's The Atheist Muslim, and that was encouraging to see. But if I played my part too, I felt that, you know what, more people would do it too, and that would hopefully normalize leaving Islam, where ex-Muslims didn't have to be terrified and they didn't have to hide anymore. When I started this journey around 2019, if you told me back then that I'd eventually be doing a YouTube video like this where I'm showing my face and spilling the beans about all this really sensitive and I guess some of it is also embarrassing stuff just about my life and my feelings about Islam, I would have told you no way. Even when I started doing social media stuff, the idea was I'm not going to show my face. It's just going to be text posts of my leaving Islam journey, which you can actually still find on Twitter and Instagram at Leaving Islam. The links are in the description below. My plan was to leave it at just that. Or you know what, maybe publish a book if I found someone willing to publish it. And after I did that for a year and a half, I felt if I wanted to try and show people that it's okay to leave Islam, I could reach so many more people by doing videos like this one where I showed my face because it's easier to connect with someone when you can see them and you can actually hear them rather than written posts, no matter how eloquently written or worded they are or how much they echo the experiences of others. It also showed that I'm not just some bot or someone paid to hate on Islam by Israel or Christians or whoever. And that's what got me started on YouTube 3 years ago. I have a lot of family members who don't know that I'm doing this and I keep it secret from them. And I also don't talk about this subject professionally as a journalist. And that's because I don't want publications to avoid working with me just because I do something controversial like publicly criticizing Islam. And that's why I go by Secular Spirit, or because that's too formal, I also go by the pseudonym of Alim, which isn't my real name. And so far, so good. I haven't got any death threats so far or anything. I do know that other ex-Muslims who are active in the same community as me, who aren't so lucky, I've been threatened that I'll be going to hell and that God will give me a reckoning on the day of judgment and all that. So I suppose those are things that are post-death threats. So I'm okay with those, I guess. And the thing I always tell those Muslims when they tell me that is, okay, I'll wait and see. And if you're right, you're right. And I suppose I'll just tell God again, well, you gave me the skeptical mind, and I could only do what was true to that mind. So basically, it's God's fault, you could say. So, what am I like today? How have I changed now that I've been an atheist for half my life? And how many Muslim friends do I have now? I do have a couple of Muslim friends. I wouldn't say they're great friends, but they're people I know in my neighborhood and mostly people I play sports with. And so we don't really talk about religion. A few of them know that I'm an atheist, but the conversation doesn't really go any further than that. And I would actually say that that's progress for me because I used to just lie and say I was Muslim when it came up, when the subject came up with other Muslims. But as I've been doing all the social media stuff and all these videos on YouTube, I've become more comfortable with being myself with people in my personal life, even if they're strangers, people in the real world. I just say, yeah, I'm an atheist. And if the awkward conversation about why I left or what I think about Islam happens with those strangers, then I deal with it. But I haven't dealt with it with any Muslim friends, kind of because there's almost an understanding, I would say, especially when you're not super close with someone, to not touch on subjects like religion. So I'm not opposed to being friends with Muslims nowadays, but I don't think I could ever be a close friend or have a best friend who is Muslim because there's just so much about that whole religion and life view that I find completely wrong. So, in the end, our values and perspectives on the world are different. The same goes for dating. I found it challenging to date someone who is from my background, whether they're Palestinian or Arabs from other countries. Now, the ones who wear hijabs or are very devout, well, that's a non starter because the gulf is far too wide from the very beginning. but most, especially in Canada, aren't devout and may even be largely non practicing. And yet they tend to still believe in God and an afterlife, and even that things like homosexuality are a sin. I tried dating Arab women over the years, and even though they were, like I said, mostly non practicing, whether they were Christian or Muslim, the issue of religion would still come up. I make sure to openly share how I didn't believe there was a God anymore early on, how I was an atheist, and then they'd be confused when I'd also explain how I never drank alcohol, but for health reasons, not religious reasons. Now, I don't agree with Islam's prohibition of alcohol or its guilt ridden categorization of it as a sin, but I do think alcohol is a harmful substance I'd rather not drink. And my atheism was a red flag for a few of those women. After all, we do come from a society where we've been all indoctrinated to think that a religious person is respectable and reliable, a family and tradition loving person, with the obvious reality being that people can be terrible and dishonest and abusive, whether they're religious or non religious. I had experiences where one woman I was dating was convinced I was bisexual because I mentioned how I didn't like when Muslims disparaged pride parades. She couldn't comprehend that I could support LGBTQ people and defend the rights unless I was one myself. That same woman also interrogated me on what I would do if we got married and had a child who came out as trans. The impression I got from her was that allowing our hypothetical child to be trans was simply not an option. And I had to agree with that for us to proceed in dating. We ended up breaking up soon after. And then there was one woman I dated who seemed non-religious at first, but then she revealed a mountain, an absolute mountain of guilt she had for dating and having sex outside of marriage. And she confessed to me that she believed that she was going to hell. I asked her if she thought I was going to hell too, and she replied, I think most of us are going to hell. Now, I sympathize with her because I used to believe the same things, but that also didn't work out. The gulf between us was too wide. That captures yet another way that being an ex Muslim is so difficult. It feels inauthentic to participate in things like Ramadan and Eid, and I recall times where I was pressured by my hosts for a Ramadan dinner to join them in prayer, and I had to awkwardly say no, that I had to leave, or other times I was pressured to go to the mosque even though those Muslims knew I was an atheist. I understood and I still understand that this comes from this place of wanting to connect with me, of wanting to help me, which made me feel bad when I rejected their overtures. Now, that's why I can't have close, meaningful relationships with Muslims, romantic or non romantic, because I either have to lie about what I believe or don't believe, or our glaring difference in values will come out in the open and keep us apart. It could be for any reason. Our view on if there's an afterlife, on homosexuality, on sin. And there's many times I couldn't be friends with a Muslim anymore after I heard them say, for example, horrible judgmental things about non-Muslims or Muslims they considered to be sinners. It is hard. It is hard to feel that there's this major thing that I don't share with most people who share my background, that I likely would never be able to live without acts of pretense if I moved back to the Middle East, which is a key reason why I've stayed in Canada all these years. At this point in my life, I've accepted that I will never be able to fully belong to the community I come from, and I've moved on to join other communities with fellow ex Muslims or simply religious people who share my values. And I am in a relationship now with an atheist who doesn't come from an Arab background. Okay, so I've talked about my personal life, but I also wanted to talk a little bit about my current politics, my current life philosophy. Right now, my secular identity informs my politics because I don't believe there's an afterlife. I don't believe that there's an objective good or a God watching out for us who'll make everything better, or that everything bad that's ever happened is happening because or has happened because of this God and it will all be rectified in the end. So I feel like all we have to rely upon is ourselves as human beings to make the world a better place. And we have these impending crises, whether it's climate change or crushing income inequality, or perhaps an upcoming World War III that could drastically alter our way of life and even wipe us out as a species. And I think for some of the more passive and fatalistic people who are religious, and I know this is true for some Muslims because I've heard them say these things to me, um, they have this feeling that these bad things are happening because it's the will of God. And they're also perhaps signs of the day of judgment that I was well versed in as a child Muslim. If you're a Muslim and you truly believe that, then bad things happening right now that might be ushering in the day of judgment are actually a good thing, because ultimately the objective is to move on to the afterlife, the most important life. As Muslims are taught, and as I was taught when I was still Muslim, this life is ephemeral, it's fleeting, and it is not the main thing that should be focused on. It's not the most important thing. The most important thing is the life beyond this one, the afterlife, the paradise, eternity with God. So I think when people have that mentality, I'm not saying that they don't care about the people around them or the world they live in, but inevitably they don't care as intensely to make things better and work together with others to address the issues that we all face together. They just can't because they have their focus on something else. Now, I can't generalize for all Muslims to say that they all feel like this. I'm just saying that for me and many others that I've met who are Muslim, that's the natural conclusion that we took from the Islamic ideology. The thought process was pretty natural that this life doesn't matter as much. So bad things happen. It's okay. God wills it, and it will all be better in paradise anyway. And that definitely impacted my view of the world, where I just felt like, well, things are bad, and that is just what it is. So I almost had this apathy about the world when I was Muslim. And I think for the most part, I've gotten rid of that apathy to try and advocate for making things better in this world, because it's the only world we know we have for sure. And to expand a bit more on this, to speak more generally, I'd say the right-wing parties in the world tend to be a bit more conservative when it comes to things like traditions and family values, the importance of marriage, banning abortions. I think these are things that are universal between Christian right-wingers that you'll find in Europe and North America and Muslims. They believe in a lot of the same things, even if they're coming at it from different religions and might hate each other and view each other as sinners. And seeing that I come from a secular and atheist background, I do value the role of tradition in life. I still miss the community celebrations of Ramadan and Eid from my childhood. But the problem of tradition is, as I saw the case in my own life and I saw all around me, problem of tradition is that it just sticks people into this position where they're inflexible to change, because they're always looking backwards to the past, thinking we have to do things the way they've always been done. We have to stick to the things that I guess have always bound us together. So when it's a Muslim, it's things like family, Islam, and all that. There's reliability and consistency in that, in knowing how to handle the unexpected challenges of the future. I get it, but the problem that comes with that is, what if those traditions are the causes of the challenges? So what if things that come from Islam need to be changed, but you can't change them because it's tradition and you have to keep them the same. You have to follow what's in the Quran because we've always followed what's in the Quran. And what if family values are constricting people, where they can't even express themselves because they have to stick to the family? They don't fit the mold of what a family is supposed to be traditionally. For me, I'm more progressive in the sense that I think that it's important to have community. It's important to have values and traditions, but they should be more flexible. They should be more reflective of changes in community and values, and they shouldn't be bound to any religion or ethnicity. We should be aspiring towards finding the common ground between all of us as humans and working together to address the really major issues that we're facing as a species. And for me, a lot of the parties, the political parties in Canada, the Liberal Party, the Conservative Party, even the NDP, which is a bit more socialist and more left leaning, I don't think they do it enough. And the same can be said of the political leaders in most countries. I am aware of the fact that this is the only life I'm going to have, as far as I can tell. And we're not going to be able to resolve the issues we're facing unless we work together and start addressing climate change in particular. Our society is kind of ass backwards in the way in which all these religious organizations get all these contributions and billions of dollars, and yet within the secular world, there doesn't exist a thing that's similar to that unites people as deeply and that's focused on this world and its challenges. And what some religious people will say, it's because you don't have a religion binding you and you don't have the strength and power of faith guiding you to do those things. I just think it's because we as a society don't have the practice of being in that area, of going in that direction. There are efforts all around the world to try and start secular community centers that focus on helping each other without religious ulterior motives and even without capitalist ulterior motives. But it's still nascent, it's still new, it's still in its infancy. We're in the beginning stages because religions have had such a monopoly over these domains of life until very recently. And in many countries, they still have that monopoly. Breaking that monopoly won't be easy in the Muslim world, but the aim of many in the ex-Muslim community, ex-Muslim advocates, and content creators like myself, who I've met in the past 5 years, is to do just that, to create this new reality where leaving Islam is normalized and where the harms of Islam are countered as much as possible. Now, normalizing leaving Islam is a long way off from happening in the Muslim world, but I think it's starting to happen more and more in the Western world, within Muslim communities that live in those countries. And that's where we have to start, because if we're not heard and don't share our perspectives, then non-Muslims just won't know about us, and Muslims will continue to have all these misconceptions, misunderstanding us. We aren't corrupted by the West. We aren't seduced by demons. We aren't ignorant about Islam. Many ex-Muslims leave Islam precisely because they seek to learn more about it. Learning more about Islam and its history is what destroys our faith. And if more Muslims understand their religion better and see the world beyond its indoctrination, I'm confident many will leave Islam too. And so that's why I did this video during Ex-Muslim Awareness Month, which is an initiative organized every December by a friend of the channel, Haram Doodles, who is a fellow ex-Muslim as well. My aim in doing this video and trying to just capture the entirety of my experience, and the aim in my other videos too, is for those of you watching to have a better understanding of the issues I went through and why Islam didn't really address them for me and why I ultimately left the religion. And beyond Islam, perhaps it will fade away one day, but it's unrealistic to think that organized religion will ever completely go away because of how well it comforts our fears of suffering and of the unknown. Despite that, I don't think we need organized religion, which is why I still advocate for a future where organized religions become obsolete. Not because they've been banned or anything, but because people will realize they no longer need them. So at long last, that's it from me. To anyone who's out there who's an ex-Muslim or a doubting Muslim or considering leaving another religion, I hope my story helped you in processing what you're going through right now, and that it helps you to see that you're not alone. There's a lot of people who are going through this or who have gone through this, and there is a light at the end of the tunnel, even if it isn't the light of heaven. And if you want to support ex-Muslims and spread awareness, please like this video and share it with non-Muslims and Muslims who might not know about our challenges and experiences. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. You can also support this channel financially through Patreon or PayPal. Links are in the description below. I'm Secular Spirit, and as always, I'll be back with another video very soon.